He said he'd be fine until she saw the blood and knew he wasn't. In the wild heart of 1874 Colorado, Scarlett Hayes never imagined that one desperate ride across dusty plains would bind her fate to Jesse Carter forever. What began as a cattle raid turned into a battle for survival, and somewhere between gunfire and moonlight, between blood and fever dreams, a ranch hand and a storekeeper's daughter discovered that some bonds are forged in fire and sealed in sacrifice. This is their story, a tale of courage, loyalty, and a love that refused to die even when death came calling. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The morning of June 14, 1874, began like any other in Crimson Creek, Colorado, which is to say it began with dust, heat, and the eternal promise of hard work under an unforgiving sun. Scarlett Hayes stood in the doorway of her father's general store, a whitewashed building that anchored the small cluster of structures that constituted the town's main street, and surveyed the world with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned early that survival meant paying attention to details others missed. She was 22 years old that summer, tall and lean in a way that suggested she'd never been one to shy from physical labor. Her auburn hair, pinned back in a practical bun that had already begun surrendering wisps to the dry wind, caught the morning light like burnished copper. Her hands, resting on the door frame, bore the calluses of someone equally comfortable handling account books and hauling flour sacks, the strange duality of her existence as both merchant's daughter and frontier woman. The store behind her smelled of coffee, leather, and the peculiar mineral scent of new fabric bolts. It was a smell she'd known all her life, as familiar and comforting as breathing. Her father, Henry Hayes, was inside going over the week's orders with old Tom Fletcher, whose ranch lay 15 miles to the east. Their voices drifted through the open door, Henry's steady baritone discussing credit terms and delivery schedules with the patient firmness that had made him successful in a territory where success often meant simply not failing. But Scarlett wasn't listening to them. Her attention was fixed on the horizon to the north, where the land rose in gentle swells toward the foothills of the Rockies. Something felt wrong. She couldn't have articulated what exactly troubled her. Perhaps it was the quality of the morning light. Perhaps it was some instinct bred into anyone who'd lived long enough on the frontier to develop a sixth sense for danger. But whatever it was, it made her uneasy. "You're frowning at the landscape again," came a voice from behind her. Scarlett turned to find Martha Brennan, the seamstress who rented the room above the store, descending the external staircase with a basket of mending balanced on her hip. Martha was 45, widowed for 3 years, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving hardship without becoming hardened by it. "Can't help it," Scarlett replied. "Something feels off today." Martha paused on the bottom step, her experienced eyes scanning the same horizon Scarlett had been studying. "Henry's herd? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just being foolish." "You've never been foolish a day in your life, girl." Martha shifted her basket. "Your instincts kept this store running when your father was laid up with that broken leg 2 winters back. If you say something's wrong, something's probably wrong." Before Scarlett could respond, she heard it, the thunder of approaching hooves, moving fast, too fast for a casual ride. Both women turned toward the sound. A rider was emerging from the heat shimmer on the northern road, pushing his horse hard enough to raise a plume of dust that marked his passage like a signal fire. Scarlett's heart began to pound. She knew that horse, knew that rider. Jesse Carter, her father's best ranch hand and newly appointed segundo, or second in command, rode as if the devil himself was on his heels. She stepped down from the boardwalk into the street, Martha forgotten, everything forgotten except the approaching rider and the dread building in her chest. Around her, Crimson Creek began to take notice. Doors opened. People emerged from buildings. A rider moving like that meant news, and news delivered at a gallop was never good. Jesse hauled his bay gelding to a sliding stop in front of the store, the animal's flanks heaving, foam flecking its bit. The ranch hand himself looked like he'd ridden through hell to get here. Dust coated every inch of him, turning his dark hair gray, streaking his sun-browned face in patterns like war paint. His shirt was dark with sweat, and his blue eyes, usually so calm and measured, blazed with urgency. "Trouble at North Ridge," he shouted, his voice carrying down the street. "Barker gang hit your father's herd at dawn.
They've got maybe 15 men, and we're outnumbered 3-1. The words hit Scarlett like a physical blow. The Barker Gang, every rancher in 3 territories knew that name and feared it. Frank Barker and his brothers had been raiding ranches from Wyoming to New Mexico for 5 years, leaving burned homesteads and dead men in their wake.
They were ruthless, organized, and deadly, more like a military unit than a gang of common rustlers. Her father's herd represented everything the Hayes family had built in 15 years in Colorado. Losing it would mean financial ruin, the end of the ranch, the end of everything they'd worked for. But more than that, Henry Hayes himself was up at North Ridge with a skeleton crew of ranch hands, men Scarlett had known for years, good men with families. "How many men does my father have with him?" she demanded. 5, including him, Jesse said, breathing hard. "We need every gun we can get. The sheriff's already riding with a posse, but they're coming from the county seat. Won't arrive for hours. We can't wait." Around them, men were already moving, running for horses, checking weapons. In Crimson Creek, as in every frontier town, every able-bodied man was part of the unofficial militia. They had to be. Law enforcement was spread too thin, distances too vast. You protected your own, or you didn't survive. Scarlett didn't hesitate. She didn't pause to think or plan or consider. She simply acted, driven by an imperative as old as humanity itself. Her father was in danger, and she would not stand idle while he fought for his life. "Take me with you," she said, reaching for Jesse's hand. He stared down at her, surprise flickering across his dust-caked face. "Scarlett, this is going to be bad. My father's up there. I'm the best shot you've got after him, and you know it." She kept her hand extended, steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "Don't waste time arguing with me, Jesse. Every second counts." For a moment they stared at each other, and in that moment, something passed between them that neither could have named. It wasn't the first time they'd looked at each other and felt that strange current of connection, that awareness of each other that went deeper than mere friendship or working relationship. It had been building for months, maybe longer, in glances across the dinner table at the ranch house, in conversations about books she'd lent him from her small library, in the way he always seemed to know where she was in a room even when he wasn't looking at her. But there was no time to examine those feelings, no time for anything except action. Jesse made his decision. He kicked his foot free from the stirrup and extended his arm down to her. "Can you handle sitting behind the saddle at a full gallop?" "Try me." She grasped his forearm, and he grasped hers in the old cavalry grip, then pulled as she jumped. For a moment she was airborne, and then she was settling behind the saddle, her arms wrapping around his waist, her skirts hiked up in a way that would have scandalized the church ladies if any of them had been paying attention to propriety at a moment like this. "Hold tight," Jesse said, and then they were moving. The bay gelding, despite its hard ride into town, responded to Jesse's urging with the heart that made it worth twice what he'd paid for it. They thundered north out of Crimson Creek, past the last scattered houses, past the cemetery where Scarlett's mother lay buried, past the point where civilization ended and the wild country began. Behind them, she could hear other riders mounting up, the impromptu militia forming itself with the organized chaos of men who'd done this before. But Jesse didn't wait for them. Every second of delay could mean another man dead, another section of fence cut, another section of the herd driven away into the maze of canyons and gullies where the Barker gang could disappear like smoke. Scarlett had ridden horses all her life, but she'd never ridden like this, flat out, pushing for speed, the landscape blurring past in streaks of tan earth and green scrub. The wind tore at her hair, pulling it free from its pins, sending it streaming behind her like a banner. She pressed close to Jesse's back, feeling the muscles of his shoulders and back working as he guided the horse, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing even in the midst of this desperate race. "How bad was it when you left?" she shouted over the thunder of hooves. "Bad enough," Jesse called back. "They hit at first light, came in from 3 directions. Your father and the boys managed to fall back to the line shack at North Ridge, but they're pinned down. The gang's after the herd, but they're not shy about killing anyone who gets in their way." Scarlett's hands tightened on Jesse's waist. She knew the line shack he meant, a rough cabin built decades ago by the previous landowner, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had gun slots built into the walls and a good field of fire.
If her father had made it there, he had a chance.
But only a chance, and only if help arrived before the Barker gang decided to burn them out. They rode hard for 20 minutes, covering ground that would have taken an hour at a normal pace. The land began to rise, the terrain becoming more broken, scattered with boulders and cut by erosion gullies. Good cattle country, but also good ambush country. Jesse's attention never wavered from the trail ahead, reading the land with the expertise of someone who'd spent half his life working cattle ranges. Scarlett had known Jesse Carter for 3 years, ever since her father had hired him away from a dying ranch to the south. He'd arrived in Crimson Creek with everything he owned in his saddlebags, a Winchester rifle across his pommel, and a quiet competence that had immediately set him apart from the usual drifting ranch hands. Within 6 months, Henry Hayes had made him segundo. Within a year, he was eating dinner with the family every Sunday, discussing ranch business with Henry and debating book recommendations with Scarlett. He was 28 years old, born in Texas before the war, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his own worth but felt no need to prove it. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, strong jaw, high cheekbones, eyes the color of a Colorado summer sky. But it was his hands that Scarlett had always noticed, capable hands, equally adept at handling a rope, a gun, or the pages of the book she lent him from her small collection. More than once, she'd caught herself watching those hands and wondering what it would be like to have them touch her with something other than polite friendliness. More than once, she'd looked up from her ledger books in the ranch office to find him watching her with an expression that suggested his thoughts were traveling similar paths. But they were both careful, both aware of the boundaries that society drew around their respective positions. She was the owner's daughter, educated back east for 2 years before her mother's death had called her home. He was a ranch hand, even if he was the best ranch hand in 3 territories. The gap between them might as well have been a canyon for all the social conventions that forbade crossing it. Or at least that's what Scarlett had always told herself in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to think about Jesse Carter and the strange, persistent ache his presence created in her chest. There! Jesse's shout jerked her from her thoughts. She looked up and saw it. North Ridge rising against the sky like a broken tooth, and beyond it, a column of smoke rising into the still morning air. No, not one column, several. They were burning something. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach since Jesse had ridden into town suddenly crystallized into ice-sharp terror. Then she heard it, the distant crack of gunfire, echoing off the rocks like thunder. They weren't too late. The fight was still happening. Jesse pushed the bay harder, and Scarlett clung to him as they raced up the slope toward the ridgeline. The sound of gunfire grew louder, resolving into individual shots now, the deep boom of rifles, the sharper crack of pistols, the occasional staccato rattle that could only be one of the new repeating carbines some of the more prosperous outlaws had acquired. As they crested a rise, the scene spread out before them like something from a nightmare. The North Ridge line shack sat in a small clearing surrounded by scattered pines and boulders. Smoke poured from a section of the roof where someone had tried to set it on fire, though it looked like the defenders had managed to put it out. Around the cabin, 15 or 20 riders circled, firing into the gun slots, keeping the defenders pinned down while other members of the gang hazed the cattle herd northward toward the canyon country. Jesse hauled the bay to a stop behind a jumble of boulders that provided cover and swung down from the saddle. Scarlett followed, her legs shaky from the hard ride, but her hands steady as she accepted the spare rifle Jesse pulled from his saddle scabbard. "You know how to use a Winchester?" he asked. She worked the lever action, chambering a round with a smooth efficiency that answered his question. "Father taught me when I was 12. I can hit a target at 200 yards. "That's my girl," Jesse said, and there was something in his voice, some warmth and pride, and something else that made Scarlett's heart skip despite the bullets flying in the valley below. More riders were arriving now, men from town, ranch hands from neighboring spreads, all converging on North Ridge in response to the call for help. Scarlett spotted Doc Morrison, who'd served as a field surgeon during the war and still kept his old Army Colt strapped to his hip. She saw John Kerrigan, who ran the lumber mill, and his 2 sons. She saw faces she'd known all her life, men who were shopkeepers and farmers and blacksmiths 6 days a week, but who became soldiers on the 7th when their neighbors needed them. A man Scarlett didn't recognize, wearing a deputy's star, was organizing them with quick, efficient commands. He pointed groups to different positions, setting up a crossfire that would catch the gang from multiple angles. When he reached Scarlett and Jesse, his eyes widened slightly at seeing a woman in the group, but he didn't waste time arguing. "You two take the high ground on that western outcrop," he ordered, pointing to a rocky formation that jutted out over the valley. "It's exposed, but it's got the best field of fire. Think you can handle it?" "We can handle it," Jesse said flatly. The deputy nodded and moved on to position the next group. Jesse turned to Scarlett, his expression serious. "That position's going to draw fire once they realize we're up there. Are you sure about this?" Scarlett checked her rifle again, then met his eyes. "My father's in that cabin, Jesse. I'm not going anywhere." Something flickered in his gaze, respect, admiration, and that other thing she'd seen before but never named. He nodded once, sharply, then gestured toward the outcrop. "Stay low and move fast. We'll set up behind those rocks at the top." They moved together, scrambling up the rocky slope with the agility of people who'd grown up in mountain country. Bullets were still flying below, but the gang hadn't yet noticed the reinforcements positioning themselves in the surrounding rocks. They were too focused on the cabin, too confident in their numbers, too certain that they could simply overwhelm the handful of defenders through sheer firepower. It was going to be the last mistake some of them ever made. Scarlett and Jesse reached the outcrop and immediately took position behind a pair of weathered boulders that provided cover while still giving them clear lines of sight to the valley below. From this vantage point, Scarlett could see the entire battlefield spread out like a tactical map, the cabin with its defenders, the circling raiders, the herd being driven north, and now, hidden in the rocks on three sides, the arriving reinforcements. "You take the left side," Jesse said, settling his rifle into position. "I'll cover the right. Don't waste ammunition. Make every shot count." "And Scarlett?" He turned to look at her, his face streaked with dust and sweat, but his eyes clear and focused. "Whatever happens, you stay behind cover. Promise me." "I promise if you promise," she countered. He smiled, a quick flash of warmth in the midst of chaos. "Deal." Below them, the deputy fired 3 quick shots in the air, the signal. The valley erupted in gunfire. The Barker gang had perhaps 5 seconds of confusion before they realized they were caught in a trap. Men who moments before had been confidently circling the cabin suddenly found themselves taking fire from 3 directions. Horses screamed and reared, raiders dove for cover or tried to return fire, but they were in the open while their attackers had the protection of rocks and elevation. Scarlett sighted down her rifle at a man wearing a distinctive red bandana, clearly one of the gang's leaders. He was shouting orders, trying to rally his men, pointing toward the western outcrop where she and Jesse had positioned themselves. She led him slightly, adjusted for wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder. The man in the red bandana spun and fell. "Good shot," Jesse said, and fired his own rifle. Another raider went down. Time became strange after that, simultaneously stretching out and compressing. Scarlett fired, worked the lever action, fired again, each shot deliberate and controlled despite the chaos raging around her. She'd always been good with a rifle. Henry Hayes had believed that everyone on a frontier ranch needed to know how to shoot, gender be damned. But she'd never shot at living targets before. She'd never taken a human life. There was no time to think about that now, no time to feel anything except the grim necessity of the moment. These men had come to destroy her father's livelihood and were willing to kill to do it. She didn't feel guilt as they fell, only a cold satisfaction that each shot meant one less threat to her father and the men trapped in the cabin. Beside her, Jesse fired with mechanical efficiency, his face expressionless, his hands steady. She realized he must have done this before, must have been in combat during his years as a younger man. The thought brought a strange comfort. At least one of them knew what they were doing. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. The Barker gang, caught between the defenders in the cabin and the reinforcements in the rocks, tried to fight back, tried to escape, tried to regroup, but they were outmaneuvered and increasingly desperate. One group of raiders attempted to charge the western outcrop, clearly hoping to eliminate the accurate fire coming from Scarlett and Jesse's position. They came up the slope in a ragged line, firing as they climbed, bullets ricocheting off the rocks around them. "Stay down!" Jesse shouted and shifted position to get a better angle. Scarlet pressed herself against the boulder, her heart hammering. She could hear the raiders getting closer, hear their boots scrambling on stone, hear their shouted curses and commands. Jesse fired repeatedly, his rifle speaking with deadly authority, and men cried out and fell back. But one man made it through, coming up behind a rock formation to their right, a position they hadn't watched carefully enough. Scarlet saw him a moment before Jesse did, saw the pistol coming up, saw the man's finger tightening on the trigger, saw death arriving with terrible clarity. She opened her mouth to scream a warning, but Jesse was already moving. He lunged sideways, one arm sweeping out to knock Scarlet backward behind the boulder as the pistol roared. The bullet passed through the space where Scarlet had been standing a moment before. So close she felt the wind of its passage against her cheek. Jesse's rifle spoke once, a single shot fired from an awkward angle while he was still in motion. The raider jerked backward and fell, tumbling down the slope in a tangle of limbs. Scarlet landed hard on the rock, the breath knocked out of her, Jesse half on top of her, his weight pinning her down. For a moment they were frozen like that, both breathing hard, his face inches from hers, his eyes wide with the adrenaline of near death and desperate action. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Thanks to you," she managed to say, though her lungs felt like they'd forgotten how to work properly. He stared at her for another moment, something fierce and unguarded in his expression, then pushed himself up and reached down to help her to her feet. Below them, the sounds of gunfire were diminishing. The raiders who were still alive were fleeing north, abandoning their dead and wounded, abandoning the herd, abandoning everything in their desperate need to escape the trap they'd ridden into. The deputy was organizing pursuit parties, but most of the militia members were focused on helping the wounded and securing the herd. Scarlet could see men emerging from the line shack, her father among them, and the relief that flooded through her made her knees weak. "He's all right," Jesse said quietly, following her gaze. "Your father's all right." "Because of you," Scarlet said, turning to face him. "You saved both our lives today. Mine, especially." Jesse shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just doing what needed doing." "It was more than that, and you know it." Before he could respond, they heard voices calling their names. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the battle was beginning to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. They made their way down from the outcrop, sliding and scrambling over rocks that suddenly seemed twice as difficult to navigate. Henry Hayes was waiting at the bottom, and when he saw Scarlet, his weathered face split in a grin of pure relief. He pulled her into a crushing hug that lifted her off her feet, just like he'd done when she was a little girl. "You shouldn't have come," he said into her hair. "You scared 10 years off my life." "You're welcome," Scarlet replied, hugging him back just as hard. When Henry finally released her, he turned to Jesse and his expression shifted from paternal relief to something more complex: respect, gratitude, and a calculating awareness that Scarlet didn't entirely understand. "I saw what you did up there," Henry said quietly. "Saw you push her out of the path of that bullet." Jesse met his gaze steadily. "She did the same for all of us by coming here. Never seen a civilian shoot like that." "Her mother taught her to read," Henry said. "I taught her to shoot. Between us, we figured we covered the important things." He paused, then extended his hand. "Thank you, Jesse, for keeping her safe." As the two men shook hands, Scarlet felt something shift in the air between all three of them, some subtle realignment of relationships and possibilities. But before she could examine that feeling, the deputy was calling for everyone to gather up, and the moment passed. The aftermath of the battle was grim work. 4 raiders lay dead in the valley, 3 more wounded badly enough that they'd be headed for trial, and probably the gallows. 2 of the militia had taken injuries, one a flesh wound to the arm, the other a more serious hit to the leg that had Doc Morrison working with intense concentration to stop the bleeding and save the limb. Miraculously, none of Henry's ranch hands had been killed, though 2 were injured and all were suffering from smoke inhalation from the burning roof. The line shack itself was damaged but repairable. The herd had scattered during the fighting, but most of the cattle were being rounded up by the pursuing parties. It could have been so much worse. It should have been worse, given how outnumbered the defenders had been. As the afternoon wore on and the immediate crisis passed, the men began to relax, to laugh, to tell stories about the battle with the exaggerated bravado that always followed survival. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey, and it passed from hand to hand, toasts being drunk to accuracy, to courage, to simple luck. Henry Hayes stood in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by his ranch hands and his neighbors, and made a pronouncement that would change Jesse Carter's life. "I'm making Jesse foreman," he announced, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Best shot, best rider, and best man I've got. If anyone has objections, voice them now." No one objected. If anything, the assembled men cheered and the whiskey bottle made another round. Jesse looked stunned, his face flushing under the praise and the attention. Scarlett, watching from where she sat on a rock at the edge of the clearing, felt a glow of pride that she knew was inappropriate and didn't care. He deserved this. He'd earned it through competence and courage, and if her heart gave an extra beat at seeing him recognized, well, that was her business. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that gave Crimson Creek its name, the militia members began preparing for the ride back to town. Wagons were organized for the wounded. The dead raiders were wrapped in blankets and tied across saddles. They'd be buried in the town cemetery, in the section reserved for outlaws and unknowns, marked by simple wooden crosses with no names. Scarlett found herself standing alone for a moment, watching the organized chaos of departure, when Jesse appeared at her elbow. He'd cleaned some of the dust from his face, and in the golden light of sunset he looked almost unbearably handsome, all sharp angles and clear eyes and quiet strength. "Hell of a day," he said. "That's one way to put it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the preparations. Then Jesse reached up and touched his side, wincing slightly. "You all right?" Scarlett asked, immediately concerned. "Fine," he said quickly. "Just caught a rock when I dove for cover earlier. Nothing serious." But Scarlett had seen enough injuries in her life to recognize the way he moved, the careful way he held his left side. "Let me see." "Scarlett, it's nothing. Jesse Carter, don't you dare nothing me after the day we've had. Let me see." Reluctantly, he lifted his arm, and Scarlett pulled aside the torn fabric of his shirt. What she saw made her breath catch. It wasn't a rock that had caught him. It was a bullet, a graze, yes, but deep enough that blood had soaked through his shirt, deep enough that the wound was still seeping. "You said you were fine," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's just a scratch," he insisted. "That is not a scratch. That's a bullet wound. Jesse, you could have been killed. But I wasn't." He smiled at her, that quick, warm smile that made her heart stutter. "Worried about me, Miss Hayes?" "Of course I'm worried about you," she snapped, covering fear with irritation. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet for me. You've been riding and shooting and climbing all day with this. What if it gets infected? What if—" "Scarlett," he said her name gently, and she stopped, looking up at him. "I'm all right, really." But even as he said it, she could see the pallor under his tan, could see the way he was starting to sway slightly. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, and exhaustion and blood loss were catching up. "We need to get you to Doc Morrison," she said firmly. "Doc's busy with men hurt worse than me." "Then I'll take care of it myself. Come on." She took his arm, careful of the wound, and led him toward her father's wagon, which had been brought up from the main ranch house. Henry saw them coming and read the situation in an instant. "How bad?" he asked quietly. "Bad enough," Scarlett replied. "He needs stitches, bandaging, and rest. Can he ride in the wagon with you back to the ranch house?" Henry nodded immediately. "Get him settled. I'll drive carefully." They helped Jesse into the wagon bed, and Scarlett climbed up after him, ignoring the raised eyebrows and whispered comments from some of the other militia members. Let them talk. Jesse had saved her life, had fought to defend her father's ranch, and she'd be damned if she was going to let him suffer because of some outdated notion of propriety. The ride back to the ranch house took over an hour as the wagon creaked along the rough trail. Scarlett sat beside Jesse in the bed, keeping him talking when he started to drift, checking his wound periodically to make sure the bleeding hadn't worsened. He tried to make light of it, tried to joke about how he'd probably just pulled a muscle, but she could see the pain in his eyes when the wagon hit particularly rough patches. "Why'd you do it?" she asked quietly as they rolled through the gathering darkness. "Do what?" "Push me out of the way of that bullet. You could have been killed." Jesse was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Couldn't do otherwise, Scarlett. When I saw that gun coming up, when I saw it aimed at you, there wasn't even a choice. I just moved.
That doesn't explain why. Doesn't it? He turned to look at her, and in the dimness of the wagon bed, his eyes were dark and serious. I think you know why. Scarlett's heart began to pound, but before she could respond, before she could ask him to put into words what she thought she saw in his face, Henry called back from the driver's seat. Ranch house ahead. Scarlett, get ready to help him inside. The moment broke. Jesse pushed himself up to a sitting position, wincing, and Scarlett moved to help support him. By the time they pulled into the ranch house yard, lanterns were already lit on the porch, and Maria Delgado, the half-Mexican housekeeper who'd worked for the Hayes family for 10 years, was waiting with the practical efficiency of a woman who'd seen plenty of wounded men in her time. Inside, she commanded, in her accented English. On the sofa in the front room. Scarlett, fetch my medicine kit. Mr. Hayes, heat water, move. They moved. Within minutes, Jesse was stretched out on the sofa, his shirt removed, his wound exposed to the lamplight. It looked worse now than it had before, angry and red, still seeping blood, the edges ragged where the bullet had torn through flesh. Maria examined it with practiced hands, then looked up at Scarlett. He is lucky. An inch to the right, and it tears the artery. He would bleed out before reaching town. As it is, he needs stitches and rest. Much rest. I'll do the stitches, Scarlett said. Maria raised an eyebrow. You have done this before. No, but I've watched you do it often enough, and my hands are steadier than they look. Very well. Maria began laying out supplies, needle, thread boiled in whiskey, clean bandages, more whiskey for Jesse to drink. I will guide you, but first we clean the wound properly. What followed was painful for everyone involved. Cleaning the wound required whiskey poured directly into the torn flesh, and despite his best efforts to remain stoic, Jesse couldn't entirely suppress his reaction. His hands clenched on the sofa cushions, his jaw locked tight, and a string of quiet curses escaped through gritted teeth. I know, Scarlett murmured, her hands as gentle as she could make them while still being thorough. I know it hurts. I'm sorry. Not your fault, he managed. The bastard who shot at you, on the other hand, is dead, Scarlett said flatly. You shot him, remember? Oh, right. Good. Despite everything, she almost smiled. Even in pain, even exhausted and injured, Jesse maintained that dry sense of humor that she'd always appreciated. The stitching was worse than the cleaning. Scarlett's hands trembled as she threaded the needle, as she made the first puncture in his skin. She'd sewn plenty of things in her life, fabric, leather, torn book bindings, but never human flesh, never someone she cared about. You're doing fine, Maria said quietly, watching her work. Small, even stitches. Don't pull too tight or you'll pucker the skin. Scarlett focused on the task, blocking out everything else. The pain on Jesse's face, her father's worried presence in the doorway, her own fear and exhaustion. There was only the needle, the thread, the wound that needed closing. Each stitch brought the torn edges closer together. Each knot secured the work. Jesse never complained, never cried out, though she could see the sweat beading on his forehead, could feel the tension in his body. Once, when she'd been working for several minutes and the silence had become almost unbearable, he spoke. Tell me something, he said, his voice strained. Anything. Just talk to me. Scarlett thought for a moment, then began telling him about the book she'd been reading, a novel about the adventures of explorers in Africa, full of danger and discovery and narrow escapes. She described the plot, the characters, the exotic landscapes, anything to distract him from what she was doing. And as she talked, she saw some of the tension leave his body, saw him focus on her words rather than his pain. By the time she tied off the last stitch, full dark had fallen outside. Maria inspected her work, nodded approvingly, and began bandaging the wound with clean white cloth. Good work, the housekeeper said. You have steady hands and a careful touch. He will heal clean if he rests and doesn't do anything stupid. I never do anything stupid, Jesse protested weakly. You threw yourself in front of a bullet today, Scarlett pointed out. Some might call that stupid. Some might call it necessary. Their eyes met, and there it was again. That current of something unnamed, something that had been building between them for months or perhaps years, now intensified by violence and fear and the simple fact of survival. They'd fought side by side. He'd saved her life. She'd tended his wound. The boundaries that society insisted on, the careful distance they'd maintained, suddenly seemed impossibly fragile. Henry Hayes cleared his throat from the doorway, breaking the moment. "Jesse, you'll stay in the spare room tonight. Doctor's orders, or in this case, my orders. You're in no condition to ride back to the bunkhouse." "Mr. Hayes, I don't want to be any trouble." "You're not. You're convalescing. There's a difference." "Scarlett, Maria, let's let the man rest. He's had more than enough excitement for one day." They left Jesse on the sofa with blankets and a pillow, and Scarlett followed her father and Maria out to the kitchen. Maria immediately began preparing a light supper. The men would be hungry when they arrived back from securing the herd, while Henry poured himself a generous measure of whiskey and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "Hell of a day," he said, echoing Jesse's earlier words. "That it was," Scarlett agreed, sitting across from him. Henry studied her in the lamplight, his weathered face thoughtful. "You did good today, daughter. I was proud of you. Your mother would have been proud of you, too." Scarlett felt her throat tighten. They rarely spoke of her mother, whose death 5 years earlier had left a hole in both their lives that nothing had quite filled. "Thank you, Papa." "That being said," Henry continued carefully, "I couldn't help but notice the way you and Jesse were looking at each other." Scarlett felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Papa, I don't know what you—" He held up a hand. "I'm not blind, and I'm not a fool. That boy's been sweet on you for at least a year, and you've been circling around each other like a pair of shy horses. Today just brought it all to the surface." "Even if that were true," Scarlett said carefully, "it doesn't change anything. I'm your daughter. He works for you. People would talk." "People always talk," Henry said dismissively. "Let them. What I care about is character, and Jesse Carter has more character than most men twice his age. He's smart, he's capable, he's honest, and as of today, he's foreman of this ranch. That's not nothing, Scarlett. A foreman position at a ranch this size, it's respectable. It's a foundation a man can build on." Scarlett stared at her father. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that if something were to develop between you and Jesse, I wouldn't object. In fact, I'd be pleased." Henry took a sip of his whiskey. "Life's too short and too uncertain, as today proved. When you find someone who'd throw themselves in front of a bullet for you, someone who makes you smile the way he makes you smile when you think I'm not looking, well, you'd be a fool to let that go because of what the church ladies might whisper." Before Scarlett could respond, they heard the sound of multiple horses arriving in the yard, the ranch hands returning from securing the herd. The quiet moment with her father evaporated as the house filled with tired, hungry men, all wanting to report on the day's events, to check on Jesse, to eat Maria's cooking, and collapse in their bunks. The evening dissolved into controlled chaos. Scarlett helped Maria serve dinner, listened to the men's stories of rounding up scattered cattle and chasing off the last of the Barker gang's stragglers, and tried not to think too hard about everything her father had said. It was near midnight when the house finally quieted. The ranch hands had stumbled off to the bunkhouse. Henry had gone to bed. Maria had retired to her small room off the kitchen. Scarlett should have gone to bed as well, but instead she found herself checking on Jesse one last time. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, one arm behind his head. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. "Too much running through my head," he admitted. "You?" "Same." She sat on the edge of the sofa, careful not to jostle him. In the dim light from the banked fire, he looked younger, more vulnerable than the capable foreman who'd led the defense of the ranch. "How's the wound?" she asked. "Hurts like hell," he said honestly. "But I'll live. Thanks to you. Thanks to Maria. I just did what she told me." "You stayed calm. You didn't flinch. That takes strength, Scarlett." They fell silent for a moment, the house settling around them with the small creaks and groans of aging wood. Outside, a nightbird called, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. "Jesse," Scarlett said finally, "what you said in the wagon earlier—" "Scarlett, if I spoke out of turn, if I made you uncomfortable, you didn't." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "You didn't make me uncomfortable at all. Actually, I've been feeling the same way. For a while now." He went very still, his blue eyes searching her face in the firelight.
You have? I have. I just didn't think. I mean, you're my father's foreman, and I'm the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Jessie said quietly. Smart, brave, capable, beautiful. You could have anyone, Scarlett. Why would you want a ranch hand? You're not just a ranch hand, you're the foreman of one of the most successful ranches in the territory. But more than that, you're a good man, Jesse Carter. You're kind, and you're honorable, and you read books, and you think about things. You don't just exist, you pay attention to the world. And today, when that gun was aimed at me, you didn't hesitate. You just acted. I told you there wasn't a choice. There's always a choice. You chose to protect me over protecting yourself. That says everything I need to know about who you are. Jesse reached up with his good hand and cupped her cheek, his palm warm and rough and infinitely gentle. If I'm half the man you think I am, then I'm doing better than I thought. Scarlett leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. When she opened them again, he was watching her with an expression that made her heart race, something raw and honest and full of possibility. We should talk about this more, she said, when you're healed and thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly right now, he protested. You're on a sofa with a bullet wound after one of the longest days either of us has ever experienced. We both need rest. Tomorrow, when the sun's up and the world makes sense again, we can figure out what this means. Jesse wanted to argue. She could see it in his face, but exhaustion and pain were catching up with him. His eyelids were growing heavy, his body sinking deeper into the cushions. Stay until I fall asleep? He asked, his voice slurring slightly. I'll stay, Scarlett promised. She sat there in the dimness, watching his breathing slow and deepen, watching the lines of pain and tension ease from his face as sleep finally claimed him. And as she sat there, she thought about everything that had happened that day, the thunder of hooves bringing news of danger, the desperate ride to North Ridge, the battle in the rocks, the moment when Jesse had thrown himself between her and death. Her life had changed today. She'd taken human lives in defense of her father's ranch. She'd discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. And she'd finally admitted, both to herself and to Jesse, feelings that had been growing for longer than she wanted to acknowledge. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Barker gang was scattered but not destroyed. Frank Barker himself, the gang's leader, had escaped the trap. There would be questions from the territorial marshal, possibly even a formal inquiry into the battle. There would be cattle to account for, damages to repair, and the eternal work of running a ranch. But for now, in this quiet moment with Jesse sleeping peacefully and the house settled around them, Scarlett allowed herself to simply feel, to feel relief that they'd survived, gratitude for second chances, and hope for whatever the future might hold. Outside, the Colorado night stretched vast and starlit over the mountains and plains. Somewhere out there, danger still lurked. But here, in her father's house, with a good man sleeping nearby and her own courage newly proven, Scarlett Hayes felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Scarlett woke to the pale gray light of dawn filtering through the parlor windows and the immediate realization that she'd fallen asleep in the chair beside the sofa. Her neck protested the awkward angle with a sharp complaint, and her back wasn't much happier about the night spent in a position the human body was never designed to maintain for hours. She straightened slowly, wincing, and her eyes immediately went to Jesse. He was still sleeping, his breathing deep and even, one arm thrown across his chest while the other dangled off the edge of the sofa. In sleep, with the morning light touching his face and the lines of pain smoothed away, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. The bandage Maria had wrapped around his torso showed white against his tanned skin, a stark reminder of how close they'd both come to death less than 24 hours ago. Scarlett stood carefully, trying not to wake him, and padded quietly toward the kitchen. The house was still mostly silent, though she could hear Maria moving around in her room, preparing for the day. Outside, roosters were crowing their eternal announcement of sunrise, and somewhere in the distance she heard the lowing of cattle being moved to fresh pasture. Life on a ranch never stopped, even after a battle, especially after a battle. There would be extra work today, damaged fences to repair, scattered cattle to locate, reports to write for the territorial marshal. The thought of all that work waiting made Scarlett's exhaustion feel heavier, but she pushed the feeling aside. Hayes women didn't have the luxury of exhaustion. Maria emerged from her room as Scarlett entered the kitchen, the older woman's dark eyes sharp and knowing as they took in Scarlett's rumpled dress and the way she moved with the stiffness of someone who'd slept sitting up. "You stayed with him all night," Maria said. It wasn't a question. "I told him I would stay until he fell asleep," Scarlett said defensively. "And then you fell asleep yourself." Maria moved to the stove and began building up the fire. "This is how rumors start, mija." "Let them start. He was wounded protecting me. The least I could do was make sure he rested comfortably." Maria made a non-committal sound that could have meant anything, then began pulling out ingredients for breakfast. "Your father, he told me what he said to you last night. About Jesse." Scarlett felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Did he?" "He did. And I think he is right. That young man, he is good for you, and you are good for him." Maria cracked eggs into a bowl with practiced efficiency. "But good or not, people will talk if you are not careful. The ranch owner's daughter and the foreman, it is not so unusual, but you must be proper about it." "We haven't even talked about what it is yet," Scarlett protested. "Nothing has happened between us." "Something has happened. Maybe not with hands or lips, but here." Maria tapped her chest over her heart. "Here, something has happened. I see it in how you look at each other. How you have looked at each other for months now." Before Scarlett could respond, they heard movement from the front room. Jesse was awake. Maria gave Scarlett a meaningful look that clearly said, "Be proper," then turned her attention back to the stove. Scarlett found Jesse attempting to sit up, his face pale with the effort. She hurried over, putting a hand on his shoulder to steady him. "Take it slow," she cautioned. "You lost a good amount of blood yesterday." "I'm fine," he said automatically, then caught her expression. "Or I will be fine. Eventually. With rest and proper care from overly worried women who stayed up all night watching me sleep. I fell asleep by accident. I know. I woke up around 3 in the morning and saw you there. You were snoring. I do not snore. Like a lumberjack." His grin was quick and teasing, and Scarlett found herself smiling back despite her embarrassment. "You're insufferable." "So I've been told." He shifted position, trying to find a way to sit that didn't pull at his wound. "What time is it?" "Just after dawn. The hands will be starting their work soon. Papa's probably already out checking on the herd." Jesse's expression immediately shifted from playful to concerned. "I should be out there with them. There's work to do after yesterday, and as foreman, you're wounded and need to rest," Scarlett interrupted firmly. "The men can manage without you for 1 day." "That's not how being foreman works." "That's exactly how being wounded works. Jesse, you can barely sit up without going pale. How do you think you're going to sit a horse?" He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, clearly recognizing the truth in her words. "I don't like being useless." "You're not useless. You're healing. There's a difference." She sat on the edge of the sofa again, careful to maintain a proper distance even though every instinct urged her closer. "Besides, Papa specifically said you were to rest. Are you really going to disobey a direct order from your boss?" "When you put it that way," he sighed, settling back against the cushions. "Fine, but only for today. Tomorrow I'm back to work. We'll see what tomorrow brings." Maria called from the kitchen that breakfast was ready, and Scarlett helped Jesse stand and make his way to the kitchen table. He moved like an old man, one hand pressed to his side, each step measured and careful. It hurt to watch him struggle. This man who was usually so capable and sure in his movements, reduced to shuffling steps by a bullet wound. Henry Hayes came in from the barn as they were settling at the table, his boots muddy and his face already showing the weariness of a man who'd started work before sunrise. His eyes took in Jesse's presence at the breakfast table and the way Scarlett hovered nearby, and something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his weathered features. "How's the patient this morning?" he asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Stubborn," Scarlett said, at the same moment Jesse said, "Fine." Henry laughed, a quick bark of amusement. "Sounds about right. Maria, that coffee smells like heaven itself." They ate breakfast together, the conversation flowing around ordinary ranch business despite the extraordinary events of the previous day. Henry reported that most of the scattered cattle had been rounded up and that the damage to the North Ridge Line shack was less severe than he'd feared. 2 of the wounded ranch hands were recovering well under Doc Morrison's care. The territorial marshal had sent word that he'd be arriving this afternoon to take statements about the battle. "They caught 3 of the Barker gang alive," Henry said, sopping up egg yolk with a piece of bread. "They'll hang, most likely, but Frank Barker himself got away, along with his brother Tom and maybe 4 or 5 others." Jesse's expression darkened. "They'll regroup, hit another ranch, another town. Probably, but not here, not for a good long while. We bloodied them too badly for that. They'll head north, maybe up into Wyoming where the pickings are easier." Henry paused. Though the marshal did warn that Frank Barker's the type to hold a grudge, said we should keep watch for a few weeks, just in case. Scarlett felt a chill run down her spine. She'd killed at least 2 men yesterday, maybe more. Had one of them been someone Frank Barker cared about? Would he come seeking revenge? As if reading her thoughts, Jesse spoke quietly. "We'll keep watch. Post extra sentries at night. Have someone ride the property lines during the day. If Barker comes back, we'll be ready." The conversation moved on to other matters, but Scarlett couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. The battle was over, but the war might not be. After breakfast, Henry headed back out to supervise the repair work, and Maria shooed both Scarlett and Jesse out of the kitchen so she could clean up in peace. They found themselves standing somewhat awkwardly in the front room, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. "I should probably try to walk around a bit," Jesse said. "Doc Morrison always said that staying still too long after an injury makes everything stiffen up." "I'll walk with you," Scarlett offered. "You're still unsteady on your feet." They made their way out to the front porch, Jesse moving slowly but with increasing confidence. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains and the earthy smell of the corrals. Several of the ranch hands were working nearby, mending tack and oiling saddles, and they called out greetings to Jesse that he returned with good-natured waves. "They respect you," Scarlett observed as they settled into the pair of rocking chairs that had sat on this porch for as long as she could remember. "They respect good work and fair treatment. Your father taught me that. A ranch runs on respect, not fear. Not every foreman understands that. I've worked for enough bad ones to know the difference." Jesse leaned back carefully, his hand still pressed to his wounded side. "The last place I worked before coming here, the foreman was a bastard who ruled through intimidation. Men did what he said because they were afraid of him, not because they respected him. It made for a miserable existence." "What made you leave?" "He hit a kid, a young hand who'd made an honest mistake with a horse. Broke the boy's nose. I told the foreman if he ever touched that kid again, I'd break more than his nose. He didn't like that. So he told the ranch owner it was him or me." Jesse shrugged. "The owner chose him. I packed my gear and left that same day. And came here. Best decision I ever made." Their eyes met, and there it was again, that current of connection, that awareness that seemed to charge the air between them. Scarlett found herself acutely conscious of how close they were sitting, how easy it would be to reach over and take his hand. "Jesse," she said quietly, "about what we talked about last night." "I meant every word," he interrupted. "I know I was exhausted and in pain, but I wasn't delirious. I've been wanting to tell you how I feel for months, but I could never find the right moment. And then yesterday happened, and I realized that waiting for the right moment was foolish. Life doesn't wait. It just happens, and you have to grab onto what matters while you can." Scarlett's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "What matters to you?" "You matter to me, more than I probably have any right to say, given that you're my boss's daughter and I'm just a ranch hand." "Foreman," she corrected. "You're the foreman, and you're not just anything, Jesse Carter. You're brave and kind and smart, and yesterday you threw yourself in front of a bullet for me. I think that gives you the right to say whatever you need to say." He turned in his chair to face her more fully, wincing slightly at the movement, but not letting it stop him. "Then I'll say it plain. I'm in love with you, Scarlett Hayes. I have been for longer than I care to admit. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing on my mind before I sleep." When I'm working out on the range, I find myself wondering what you're doing, what you're reading, whether you're thinking about me even a fraction as much as I'm thinking about you. And yesterday, when I saw that gun aimed at you, my body moved before my brain could even process what was happening, because the thought of you being hurt was more than I could bear. Scarlett felt tears prickling at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming emotion of hearing him say out loud what she'd been feeling for so long. "Jesse." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know this isn't simple. I know there are complications with me being foreman and you being the owner's daughter. I know people will talk, and some of them won't be kind about it. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, if there's even a chance that you might want to see where this could go, then I'm willing to face all of that. I'm willing to face anything, as long as I'm facing it with you." For a moment, Scarlett couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her heart too full. She'd imagined this conversation in 100 different ways over the past year, but the reality of it was so much more powerful than any of her imaginings. "I do feel the same way," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried not to. Tried to tell myself it was impractical or inappropriate or any number of other excuses. But the truth is, I've been in love with you for months, Jesse. Maybe longer. And yesterday, when you pushed me out of the way of that bullet, when I saw you bleeding and realized you could have died, I knew I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep maintaining this careful distance we've been keeping." "So what do we do about it?" Jesse asked. "I don't know," Scarlett admitted. "We take it one day at a time, I suppose. We're honest with my father, though I think he already knows. We're careful not to give the gossips too much ammunition, and we see where this goes." Jesse reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong against hers. "I can live with that. As long as at the end of each day, I know that you're mine and I'm yours, I can handle whatever else comes our way." They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined, watching the ranch come alive with the day's activities. It wasn't the grand romantic moment that novels were made of. They were sitting on a dusty porch in their work clothes. Jesse was wounded and exhausted, and there were a dozen things that needed doing. But to Scarlett, it felt more real and true than any fictional romance ever could. This was life, messy and complicated and beautiful all at once. The sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Scarlett looked up to see a group of riders coming up the main road from town. Official-looking men in clean clothes, led by someone wearing a marshal's star that caught the sunlight like a beacon. "That'll be the territorial marshal," Jesse said, reluctantly releasing her hand and straightening in his chair. "Come to take statements about yesterday." "You should probably be resting, not giving statements." "I was there. I fought. He'll want to hear from me." Jesse pushed himself to his feet, moving more easily now that he'd had time to wake up fully. "Besides, I want to make sure the record is clear about what happened. Those men came onto your father's property with the intent to steal and kill. What we did was self-defense, pure and simple." Scarlett stood as well, smoothing down her skirts and tucking stray wisps of hair behind her ears. She knew she must look a sight. She'd slept in her clothes, hadn't had time to properly wash or fix her hair, and probably had shadows under her eyes deep enough to plant crops in. But the territorial marshal would have to take her as she was. They all would. The riders pulled up in front of the house, and the man with the marshal's star dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He was in his 50s, Scarlett guessed, with iron gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen more than his share of frontier violence. "Henry Hayes around?" he asked without preamble. "Out at the North Ridge Line shack, supervising repairs," Scarlett replied. "I'm his daughter, Scarlett. This is Jesse Carter, the ranch foreman." The marshal's eyes sharpened as he looked at Jesse, taking in the bandage visible beneath his open shirt collar. "You the one who took down 3 of the Barker gang from that western outcrop?" "Miss Hayes and I both were on that outcrop," Jesse said carefully. "We both took down our share." "That's so." The marshal turned his attention to Scarlett, and she could see him reassessing her, looking past the feminine exterior to see the woman who'd fought in yesterday's battle. "You know how to handle a rifle, Miss Hayes?" "My father taught me. I can hit a target at 200 yards. "So I've heard. The deputy who organized the militia defense gave me his report this morning, said you were cool as ice up there, never panicked, made every shot count." The marshal paused.
Also said Jesse Carter here pushed you out of the way of a bullet and took a wound doing it. That true? It is, Scarlett confirmed. Then I suppose I owe you thanks, Mr. Carter. One less civilian casualty makes my paperwork considerably easier. The marshal's tone was dry, but there was genuine appreciation in his eyes. Now, I need to take full statements from everyone who participated in yesterday's action.
We've got 3 of the Barker gang in custody, and they'll face trial for cattle rustling, attempted murder, and about a dozen other charges. But the territorial judge is going to want a complete picture of what happened. What followed was several hours of detailed questioning. The marshal was thorough, asking about everything from the moment Jesse had ridden into town with news of the attack to the final moments when the surviving gang members had fled north. He spoke with Scarlett, with Jesse, with Henry when he returned from the line shack, with every ranch hand who'd been involved in the fight. Scarlett found the process exhausting, having to relive every moment of the battle, having to describe in cold, clinical detail the men she'd shot, the fear she'd felt, the split-second decisions that had meant the difference between life and death. But she forced herself to remain composed, to answer every question as clearly and honestly as she could. The marshal seemed satisfied with what he heard. Far as I'm concerned, this was a clear case of self-defense and defense of property. The Barker gang has been terrorizing this territory for years, and it's about time someone made them pay for it. You folks did good work yesterday. Risky, but good. What about Frank Barker? Henry asked. You think he'll come back? The marshal's expression turned grim. Hard to say. Frank's prideful, and you dealt his gang a serious blow. Killed 4 of his men, captured 3 more, scattered the rest. That's not something a man like him forgets. On the other hand, he's also practical. He knows you're prepared now, knows you've got good men and good defenses. He might decide it's not worth the risk and move on to easier targets. But he might not, Jesse said. But he might not, the marshal agreed. My advice is to keep your guards up for the next few weeks. Post sentries, vary your routines, keep your weapons close. If he does come back, it'll be soon, while his anger is still hot. After a few weeks, if you haven't seen any sign of him, you can probably relax a bit. It wasn't the reassurance Scarlett had been hoping for, but it was honest, and she appreciated that. The marshal and his men rode out an hour later, taking their statements and their warnings with them, leaving the ranch to settle back into something approaching normalcy. But normal was harder to find than Scarlett had expected. Every unexpected sound made her jump. Every rider approaching the ranch made her reach instinctively for a weapon. She found herself checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows, found herself unable to fully relax even in the supposed safety of her own home. Jesse seemed to sense her unease. That afternoon, as she was attempting to work on the ranch accounts and failing miserably to concentrate, he appeared in the doorway of her father's office. "Want to take a walk?" he asked. "I'm supposed to be moving around to keep from getting stiff, and it's easier with company." Scarlett looked down at the ledger in front of her, at the numbers that refused to add up properly because she kept losing her place. "A walk sounds perfect." They headed out toward the eastern pasture, moving slowly to accommodate Jesse's injury. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the meadow beyond the fence line. Around them, the ranch hummed with activity. Cattle grazing, horses moving in the corrals, men working on the endless tasks that kept a successful operation running. "You're wound up tighter than a watch spring," Jesse observed after they'd walked in silence for a few minutes. "Is it that obvious?" "To me it is. You keep looking over your shoulder like you expect Frank Barker to come riding out of the trees at any moment." Scarlett sighed. "I can't help it. The marshal said he might come back, and all I can think about is what could happen. What if he attacks at night? What if he brings more men? What if the sun doesn't come up tomorrow?" Jesse interrupted gently. "What if the mountains fall down? What if the sky turns purple? You can't live your life on what-ifs, Scarlett. You'll drive yourself crazy." "How are you so calm about this? You're the one he'd most likely target if he came back. You killed several of his men. You're the foreman. You're..." "Scared," Jesse finished. "I'm scared too, Scarlett. I'd be a fool not to be. But fear isn't the same thing as panic. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you careful, keeps you alive. Panic just makes you useless." They reached the fence line and stopped, leaning against the weathered wood and looking out over the pasture. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace, and Scarlet found herself envying its freedom, its ability to simply soar above all earthly concerns. "I killed men yesterday," she said quietly. "I know they were trying to kill us. I know it was necessary, but I still killed them. I took away their futures, their possibilities, everything they could have been. And I don't feel as guilty about it as I think I should." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "You feel guilty about not feeling guilty. That's common after combat. I've seen it before, in men who fought in the war." "You were in the war?" "For about 6 months, right at the end. I was 17, lied about my age to join up because I thought it was the right thing to do. Saw some action, saw some death, saw enough to know that war isn't glorious or noble or any of the things the recruitment posters claimed." He turned to look at her. "And I learned that there's a difference between killing and murder. Murder is taking a life for cruel or selfish reasons. What you did yesterday wasn't murder, Scarlet. It was survival. Those men made their choice when they rode onto your father's property with guns drawn and violence in their hearts. You didn't choose that fight. They did. You just had the courage to finish it." "Does it get easier?" Scarlet asked. "The memory of it?" "It gets more distant. Time has a way of smoothing rough edges, turning sharp memories into something you can live with. But easier? I don't know. Maybe it's not supposed to be easy. Maybe carrying that weight is part of what keeps us human, what keeps us from becoming the kind of people who can kill without caring." Scarlet leaned her head against his shoulder, seeking comfort in his solid presence. He shifted to put his arm around her, careful of his wound, and they stood like that for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the pasture as afternoon edged toward evening. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For understanding. For not telling me I shouldn't have been there, that fighting is men's work. For treating me like a capable partner instead of a delicate flower that needs protecting." Jesse's arm tightened around her. "You're the furthest thing from a delicate flower I've ever met. You're steel wrapped in silk, Scarlet Hayes. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." They walked back to the ranch house as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Maria had dinner ready, and they ate with Henry and a few of the senior ranch hands, the conversation flowing easily around ordinary topics: weather, cattle prices, the new horse Henry was thinking of buying for breeding stock. It felt almost normal, almost like any other evening on the ranch, but Scarlet was aware of the undercurrent of tension, the way the men kept their gun belts close, the way Henry had positioned extra sentries around the property. They were all waiting, all watching, all preparing for the possibility that Frank Barker's revenge might arrive with the darkness. After dinner, Scarlet helped Maria clean up while the men gathered on the porch to smoke and talk. Through the open window, she could hear their voices, low and serious, discussing watch schedules and defensive positions, planning for a war that might never come but preparing as if it was inevitable. "You should rest," Maria said, watching Scarlet scrub the same plate for the 3rd time. "You are exhausted, mija. I can see it in your eyes." "I slept last night." "You sat in a chair and dozed. That is not the same as proper sleep in a proper bed." Maria took the plate from Scarlet's hands. "Go. Lie down. I will finish here." Scarlet wanted to argue, but the truth was she was exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through yesterday's battle and today's aftermath had finally drained away, leaving her feeling hollowed out and fragile. She made her way to her bedroom, the small space at the back of the house that had been hers since childhood, and changed into her nightgown with mechanical movements. But sleep, when she lay down, refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the battle replaying itself. The muzzle flashes, the faces of men as they fell, the moment when Jesse had thrown himself in front of that bullet. Her mind wouldn't stop churning, wouldn't stop running through scenarios of what could have happened, what might still happen. She must have eventually dozed off, because she woke with a start to find her room dark and the house silent around her. Something had woken her, some sound that didn't belong to the normal nighttime chorus of the ranch. She lay still, listening, her heart pounding. There. She heard it again. A soft footstep on the porch, careful and stealthy. Then another. Someone was outside the house, moving with the deliberate quiet of someone who didn't want to be heard. Scarlett's hand went immediately to the pistol she'd taken to keeping under her pillow. She eased it out, her movements silent, and slipped out of bed. The floorboards were cold under her bare feet as she crept to the window and peered carefully around the edge of the curtain. At first she saw nothing but darkness and shadows. Then a figure moved, separating itself from the deeper black of the barn wall, and Scarlett's breath caught. A man, or maybe more than one, definitely moving toward the house with deliberate stealth. She needed to raise the alarm. She turned toward her door, pistol in hand, but before she could take a step, she heard a voice from outside. Jesse's voice, sharp and commanding. "That's far enough. State your business or I start shooting." There was a moment of tense silence, and then a different voice responded, one Scarlett didn't recognize. "Easy there, friend. We're not looking for trouble." "Then why are you skulking around in the dark like thieves?" Jesse demanded. Through her window, Scarlett could see him now, standing near the corner of the house with his rifle leveled at the figures in the shadows. He was fully dressed despite the late hour, and she realized he must have been on watch. "We're riders from the Bar T Ranch, 2 valleys over," the stranger said. "We've been tracking the remnants of the Barker gang all day, and the trail led us here. We wanted to make sure you folks were safe before we bedded down for the night." "The Bar T is 60 miles from here. Why would the trail lead you to this specific ranch?" "Because Frank Barker was heard making threats against the Hayes Ranch specifically. Said he was going to burn it to the ground for what you did to his gang yesterday." The stranger paused. "Look, I know this looks bad, us showing up in the middle of the night like ghosts, but we're friends, not foes. If you want proof, old Thomas Barr himself sent a letter of introduction. It's in my saddlebag." By now, other voices were joining the conversation, ranch hands who'd been roused by the commotion, Henry's voice asking sharp questions, someone lighting a lantern that cast pools of yellow light across the yard. Scarlett threw a robe over her nightgown and hurried outside, still clutching her pistol. The scene that greeted her looked like something from a stage play. Jesse and 3 of the ranch hands standing with weapons drawn, facing 4 dust-covered riders who sat their horses with their hands carefully visible and non-threatening. Henry was examining a piece of paper by lantern light, his expression skeptical, but slowly relaxing. "It's authentic," he finally said. "Thomas's signature, his seal. These men are who they say they are." He looked up at the lead rider. "My apologies for the hostile reception, but after yesterday, we're not taking any chances." "No apology necessary," the rider said, dismounting now that the tension had eased. "We'd have done the same in your position. I'm Jack Crawford, foreman for the Bar T. Thomas sent us when word reached him about the Barker gang hitting your spread. He figured you might need extra guns if they came back." "That's kind of him," Henry said. "Appreciate the offer. You boys can bed down in the barn for the night, and we'll talk more in the morning." As the riders from the Bar T were being shown to the barn, Jesse finally lowered his rifle and turned toward the house. He spotted Scarlett standing on the porch in her nightgown and robe, pistol in hand, and something like pride flickered across his exhausted face. "You were ready," he said as he climbed the steps. "So were you. Do you ever sleep?" "I was sleeping just with my boots on and my rifle close. Learned that trick in the war. Sleep light and stay ready." He glanced at the pistol she was holding. "Nice to see I'm not the only one who's prepared. After yesterday, I'm sleeping with a small arsenal under my pillow." They stood there on the porch while the ranch settled back into uneasy sleep around them. The false alarm had everyone on edge, but it had also proven that their defenses were working, that they were alert and ready. "You should get some real sleep," Scarlett said softly. "You're still healing." "So should you. You look exhausted." "I was sleeping until I heard someone sneaking around outside my window." Jesse winced. "Sorry about that. I was doing a patrol of the perimeter when I spotted them. Didn't mean to wake the whole house." "Better to wake the house than let potential enemies get close." Scarlett paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since she'd heard the rider's message. "Do you really think Frank Barker will come back?" Jesse was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the lantern light. "Yes," he finally said. "I think he will. A man like that, he can't let a defeat like yesterday stand. It makes him look weak, and in his world, weakness is death.
He'll come back to make an example, to show that you can't cross the Barker gang and live to tell about it. When? Soon. The longer he waits, the harder it gets, the more chance we have to fortify our position. If I were him, I'd hit within the next 3 or 4 days. The thought should have terrified her, but instead Scarlett felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. They knew the threat was coming, they were prepared, and they wouldn't be facing it alone. Then we'll be ready, she said firmly.
Jesse looked at her, and in the dim light his smile was warm and proud. Yes, we will. They stood together on the porch as the night deepened around them. Two people who'd found each other in the midst of violence and chaos, who discovered that love could bloom even in the harsh soil of the frontier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Frank Barker's revenge was coming like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and destructive. But tonight, they had this moment. They had each other. And in a world as uncertain as the Colorado Territory in 1874, that was more than many people ever found. Scarlett reached out and took Jesse's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd been holding hands for years instead of just beginning to acknowledge what existed between them. He squeezed gently, a silent promise of protection, of partnership, of possibility. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And somehow, that made even the threat of Frank Barker's vengeance seem manageable. The night stretched out before them, full of shadows and uncertainty, but also full of hope. And for now, that was enough. The next 3 days passed in a strange state of suspended tension, like the air before a thunderstorm, when every living thing can sense the coming violence but can't predict exactly when it will strike. The ranch operated on a wartime footing, extra guards posted around the clock, weapons kept within arm's reach at all times, nobody riding out alone or venturing far from the main buildings after dark. Even the cattle seemed to sense the unease, moving restlessly in their pastures and startling at shadows. Jesse recovered quickly, the resilience of youth and good health working in his favor. By the second day after the battle, he was moving with only slight stiffness, though Scarlett noticed he still pressed his hand to his wounded side when he thought no one was watching. By the third day, he'd resumed most of his duties as foreman, organizing the defense preparations with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this before. The riders from the Bar T Ranch proved their worth immediately. Jack Crawford, their foreman, was a veteran of the war like Jesse, and the two men worked together seamlessly to establish overlapping patrol routes and defensive positions. The Bar T men integrated smoothly with the Hayes ranch hands, all of them understanding that whatever personal differences or ranch rivalries might exist in normal times, those things meant nothing when facing a common enemy. Scarlett found herself caught between two worlds during those days. Part of her wanted to be involved in every aspect of the defense preparations, to prove that she was as capable as any of the men. But another part of her recognized that she had responsibilities that couldn't be neglected even in the face of potential attack. The ranch accounts still needed managing, supplies still needed ordering, correspondence still needed answering. Life, in all its mundane demands, continued even when death might be riding toward them across the Colorado plains. She was working on the ledgers in her father's office on the afternoon of the third day when Jesse appeared in the doorway. He'd been out riding the fence line with two of the Bar T men, checking for signs of surveillance or preparation for attack, and dust coated him from hat to boots. "Find anything?" she asked, setting down her pen. "Maybe." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, which immediately set Scarlett's nerves on edge. Jesse never closed doors unless the conversation was private or serious. "We found tracks about 2 miles north of here, near that stand of cottonwoods by the creek. 4 horses, maybe 5, moving slow and careful like they were scouting rather than traveling. Tracks are fresh, made sometime last night or early this morning." Scarlett felt her stomach clench. "Barker's men?" "Can't say for certain, but who else would be scouting our property?" Jesse moved to the window and looked out over the ranch yard, his expression troubled. "Jack thinks they'll come tonight. Said in his experience, scouts usually report back within 24 hours, and attacks happen at night when defenders are tired and visibility is poor. So we have maybe 12 hours to prepare. If we're lucky, could be less." He turned back to face her, and the concern in his eyes was evident. "Scarlett, I need you to promise me something." "That depends on what you're asking." "If shooting starts tonight, I need you to stay in the house. Not out on the ridge like last time, not anywhere you could catch a bullet. Inside with the doors barred and your father's gun collection at hand. Scarlett stood, her hands flat on the desk. Jesse, I proved I can fight. I proved I can help defend this ranch. You can't ask me to hide while everyone else. I can ask, and I am asking. He crossed to the desk, his expression intense. Scarlett, last time we had the element of surprise, we had position, we had them caught in a crossfire. This time they'll be coming prepared, coming in the dark, coming with the specific goal of killing as many of us as possible. It's going to be chaos and confusion, and in that kind of fight, people die. Good people, careful people, people who do everything right still die because a stray bullet finds them or because someone gets lucky with a shot in the dark. And you think I'll be safer cowering inside? I think you'll be safer behind stone walls and locked doors. Yes, this house is built solid. Your father made sure of that when he had it constructed. The walls will stop most bullets, and if Barker's men try to burn us out, we've got water barrels positioned all around. You can defend the house if you need to, but you won't be exposed on a ridge or in the open where one lucky shot could... His voice cracked slightly, and he stopped, taking a breath before continuing. I can't lose you, Scarlett. I just found you. I can't lose you. The raw emotion in his voice made Scarlett's anger drain away, leaving only understanding and a deep, aching tenderness. She walked around the desk and took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that marked a life of hard work. You won't lose me, she said softly, and I won't lose you. We're going to get through this, Jesse, both of us. You can't promise that. Neither can you. But I can promise that I'll be careful, that I'll think before I act, that I won't take stupid risks. She squeezed his hands. I'll stay in the house if the attack comes, but I'm keeping a rifle with me and defending my home if anyone tries to breach those walls. It wasn't the complete capitulation he'd been hoping for, but Jesse knew Scarlett well enough to recognize when she'd made her final offer. He nodded slowly, then pulled her into his arms, careful of his still healing wound. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing comfort from each other's presence, neither one wanting to acknowledge that this might be the calm before a storm that could tear them apart forever. Scarlett pressed her ear to his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, memorizing the sound of it. I love you, she whispered, the words emerging before she could think about whether it was the right time or the right place to say them. Jesse's arms tightened around her. I love you too. More than I probably have the words to express. A knock on the door made them spring apart like guilty teenagers, though not before Henry Hayes pushed the door open and caught them standing perhaps a bit closer than propriety would strictly approve. His weathered face showed no surprise, only a kind of weary acceptance. Jesse, Jack Crawford wants to go over the defensive positions one more time before sunset. Scarlett, Maria's asking if you can help her move the medical supplies to the cellar where they'll be safer. He paused, looking between them. And both of you should know that I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid. Whatever's developing between you two, I have no objections. But let's all try to survive the next 24 hours before we start planning any futures. Agreed? Agreed, Scarlett and Jesse said in unison, and despite the tension of the moment, Henry's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. The afternoon dissolved into a flurry of final preparations. Scarlett helped Maria move not just medical supplies, but also food, water, ammunition, and blankets down to the cellar, creating a refuge that could sustain them for days if the house came under siege. The older woman worked with quiet efficiency, her face calm, but her eyes showing the strain of someone who'd lived through violence before and knew what it could cost. You are afraid, Maria observed as they carried the last crate of supplies down the narrow cellar stairs. Terrified, Scarlett admitted, but trying not to show it. Good. Fear is smart. Fear keeps you careful. It is the people who are not afraid who do foolish things and get killed. Maria set down her crate, turned to face Scarlett. You listen to me, mija. When the shooting starts tonight, and it will start, I can feel it in my bones. You stay low. You stay behind cover. You think before you act. Jesse, he cares for you very much. Do not make him watch you die. I don't plan to die tonight. No one ever does. But death does not care about our plans. Maria gripped Scarlett's shoulders, her dark eyes intense. You are strong, you are brave, you are capable, but you are also young, and the young always think they are invincible. You are not. None of us are. So you be smart tonight, yes? You be very, very smart." Scarlett nodded, her throat too tight for words, and Maria pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace before releasing her and heading back upstairs to continue preparations. As sunset approached, the ranch took on the atmosphere of a military encampment. Men checked and rechecked their weapons, loaded extra ammunition into their pockets, tied bandanas around their necks that could be pulled up over their faces to protect against smoke. Jesse and Jack Crawford moved from position to position, making final adjustments to the defensive arrangements, ensuring everyone understood the plan and their role in it. The plan itself was relatively simple, layers of defense designed to slow and damage any attacking force before it could reach the main ranch buildings. The outer perimeter was marked by strategically placed sentries hidden in the rocks and trees, men who would fire warning shots at the first sign of approach and then fall back to the second line of defense. That second line consisted of men positioned behind the fence lines and outbuildings, providing covering fire for the retreat of the outer sentries while engaging the enemy at medium range. The final line of defense was the ranch house itself and the barn, both of which had been fortified as much as possible in 3 days' time. Scarlett watched the preparations from the porch, her father's Winchester rifle already in her hands, her pockets heavy with ammunition. She'd dressed practically for the night ahead. A simple cotton dress that allowed for easy movement, sturdy boots, her hair braided tightly against her head so it wouldn't fall into her face if shooting started. She felt simultaneously ready for anything and completely unprepared for what was coming. "You should eat something," Henry said, joining her on the porch with 2 plates of the stew Maria had prepared. "Going to be a long night, and you'll need your strength." Scarlett accepted the plate, even though her stomach was twisted too tightly to feel hungry. They ate in companionable silence, watching the sun sink toward the western peaks and paint the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. "Your mother and I used to sit here and watch the sunset," Henry said quietly. "Every evening when the weather was fine, we'd come out here and just watch the day end. She said it reminded her that no matter how hard things got, there was always beauty in the world if you knew where to look for it." "I miss her," Scarlett said, her voice catching slightly. "So do I. Every day." Henry set down his plate and looked at his daughter, really looked at her, taking in the capable young woman she'd become. "She'd be proud of you, you know. The way you handled yourself in that battle. The way you've taken charge of things around here when I needed you to. You've got her courage and her stubbornness, mixed with enough of my common sense to keep you from doing anything too foolish. Papa, let me finish. I need to say this now, while I can." Henry's voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. "If something happens to me tonight, the ranch goes to you. Everything, the land, the cattle, the accounts, all of it. And I want you to know that I trust you to run it, with Jesse's help if you're smart enough to keep him around, which you should be, because that young man is worth 10 of most men I've met." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Scarlett said fiercely. "We're all going to survive this, and tomorrow we'll laugh about how worried we were." "Maybe so, but I've lived long enough to know that tomorrow isn't guaranteed to anyone, so I'm saying what needs saying while I have the chance." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "I love you, Scarlett. You're the best thing I ever had a hand in making." Before Scarlett could respond, a rifle shot cracked in the distance, the prearranged signal from the outer sentries that riders were approaching. The shot was followed immediately by 2 more, the pattern that meant multiple riders coming fast. Henry was on his feet instantly, his plate forgotten. "Inside! Now!" Scarlett grabbed her rifle and followed her father into the house. Maria was already there, closing and barring the shutters with practiced efficiency, turning the warm, welcoming ranch house into a fortress. Through the narrowed gaps in the shutters, Scarlett could see men running to their positions, could hear Jesse's voice shouting commands, could feel her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. The outer sentries came galloping into the ranch yard, their horses lathered and wild-eyed. 15 riders, maybe 20, one of them shouted, "Coming in hard from the north, torches lit. They mean to burn us out." The words had barely left his mouth when the night exploded into violence. The attacking riders came in a loose line, spread out to make themselves harder to hit, torches blazing in the darkness like malevolent stars. They were shouting as they came, wild whoops and curses meant to intimidate and confuse, and the sound of it made Scarlett's blood run cold. This wasn't the tactical ambush of 3 days ago. This was raw, brutal assault, men bent on destruction and revenge. The defenders opened fire from their positions, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness in staccato bursts of orange and red. Scarlett saw one of the attacking riders jerk and fall from his saddle, then another. But the rest kept coming, and now they were throwing their torches, arcing trails of fire through the night air toward the ranch buildings. One torch hit the roof of the chicken coop and stuck there, flames immediately beginning to spread across the dry wood. Another landed in the dirt of the yard and lay there burning uselessly. A third crashed through the window of the barn, and within moments, smoke began pouring from the structure. "The barn!" Henry shouted. "We need to save the horses!" But before anyone could move toward the burning barn, a second wave of attackers came from the east, catching the defenders in a crossfire. These riders weren't carrying torches, they were focused purely on killing, and their gunfire was accurate and sustained. Jesse had positioned himself near the corner of the house, where he could cover both approaches, and Scarlett watched through the shutters as he worked his rifle with mechanical precision, firing and levering in a smooth rhythm that spoke of experience and training. Men fell under his fire, but more kept coming, and now some of the attackers had dismounted and were using the outbuildings for cover, turning this into the kind of sustained firefight that favored whoever had more ammunition and better nerves. Scarlett moved from window to window, firing through the narrow gaps in the shutters whenever she had a clear target, trying to remember everything her father had taught her about breathing and aim and leading moving targets. The noise was overwhelming, the crack of rifles, the boom of shotguns, the screams of wounded horses and wounded men, the roar of flames from the burning barn. Smoke was drifting across the yard now, adding confusion to the chaos, making it hard to tell friend from enemy in the darkness. A bullet punched through the shutter near Scarlett's head, showering her with splinters. She jerked back instinctively, her heart in her throat, then forced herself to return to the window and keep firing. She couldn't see if her shots were hitting anything, couldn't tell if she was making any difference at all, but she kept shooting because the alternative was to huddle on the floor in terror, and she refused to give in to that impulse. Through the smoke and confusion, she caught glimpses of individual moments of violence. One of the Bar T riders going down with a scream, clutching his leg. Jack Crawford dragging the wounded man to cover while returning fire with his pistol. Her father standing on the porch, silhouetted against the firelight, working his rifle like an avenging angel. And Jesse, always Jesse, his face grim and focused, directing the defense even while fighting himself. The battle seemed to go on forever, though it couldn't have been more than 15 or 20 minutes. Time became elastic and strange, stretching out during moments of terror and compressing during moments of action. Scarlett lost track of how many times she'd reloaded, lost track of how many shots she'd fired, lost track of everything except the desperate need to protect her home and the people she loved. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack broke. The surviving raiders were falling back, retreating into the darkness beyond the firelight, taking their dead and wounded with them, or abandoning them where they'd fallen. The gunfire became sporadic, then ceased entirely, leaving only the crackle of flames from the burning barn and the moans of wounded men. For a moment, nobody moved. Everyone was frozen in place, waiting to see if this was a retreat or just a regrouping before another assault. But as the seconds stretched into minutes and no renewed attack came, the defenders began to cautiously emerge from their positions. Scarlett stumbled out onto the porch, her ears ringing from the gunfire, her hands shaking with adrenaline crash. The scene that greeted her looked like something from a nightmare. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames shooting 30 feet into the air, lighting up the entire ranch yard with hellish orange light. The chicken coop was also burning, though less intensely. Bodies lay scattered across the yard. She counted at least 5, maybe more, partially hidden by smoke or darkness. Blood was everywhere, dark and glistening in the firelight. "Casualty report!" Jesse was shouting, moving from position to position, checking on his men. "Who's hit? How bad?" The answer came back in fragments from different parts of the yard. 2 of the Bar T riders wounded, one seriously. One Hayes ranch hand shot through the shoulder. Another with a bullet graze across his ribs. Miraculously, no one on the defending side had been killed, though several of the attacking raiders lay dead or dying in the yard. Henry was already organizing bucket brigades to fight the fires, though the barn was clearly lost. The best they could hope for was to prevent the flames from spreading to other buildings. Men ran for the well and the water barrels, forming human chains to pass buckets hand to hand, working with desperate efficiency. Scarlett started to move toward the bucket brigade, but Jesse caught her arm. He was breathing hard, his face streaked with powder smoke and sweat, but his eyes were fierce and alive with the peculiar energy that comes after surviving combat. "You did good," he said, having to speak loudly over the roar of the fire. "You stayed smart, stayed in cover, kept fighting. I'm proud of you." "We survived," Scarlett said, and then the reality of it hit her and she started to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that she couldn't quite control. "We actually survived. They tried to kill us all, and we survived." Jesse pulled her against him, one hand tangled in her hair, his breath warm against her ear. "We survived. But Scarlett, this isn't over. Barker lost men tonight, but he got away again. He's going to be more desperate now, more dangerous. We need to—" A shout from the darkness cut him off. "Ryder coming in. Looks like he's alone." Everyone still capable of holding a gun immediately brought their weapons up, aiming at the figure emerging from the smoke and darkness. For a moment, Scarlett thought it might be another attack, a suicide charge by some fanatic. But as the rider came closer, moving slowly with his hands raised high, she realized this was something different. The rider was young, maybe 18 or 19, and he was wounded. Blood soaked his left arm and the entire left side of his shirt. His face was pale with pain and fear, and when he spoke, his voice shook. "Don't shoot, please don't shoot. I'm done. I surrender." Jesse moved forward cautiously, his rifle still raised. "Get down from that horse, slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." The young rider complied, sliding from his saddle with a grimace of pain. Up close, in the firelight, he looked even younger than Scarlett had first thought, barely more than a boy, with fear written clearly across his features. "I'm done fighting," he said again. "I didn't sign up for this. Frank said we were going to rustle some cattle, maybe scare some folks. He didn't say nothing about burning buildings and killing everyone. This ain't right. This ain't what I thought I was doing." "What's your name?" Henry asked, stepping forward. "Tom Billings, sir, from a little farm up north of here. My pa died last winter, and I needed money for my ma and my sisters. Frank Barker, he offered good pay for a few months' work, and I thought—" The boy's voice broke. "I thought it would be an adventure. I didn't think it would be this." Henry and Jesse exchanged a long look, some wordless communication passing between them. Finally, Henry nodded toward the house. "Maria, we've got another wounded man here. Get him patched up, get some food in him, then lock him in the cellar until we figure out what to do with him. The territorial marshal can sort out his fate." As Maria led the surrendering rider away, muttering in Spanish about foolish boys and their foolish choices, Jesse turned to Henry. "He might have information, where Barker's hiding, how many men he has left, what he's planning next. Then we'll question him once he's stable. But not tonight. Tonight we put out these fires, tend our wounded, and count our blessings that we're still breathing." Henry's voice was rough with exhaustion. "Jesse, organize watches for the rest of the night, double the normal guard. Everyone else, let's save what we can of these buildings." The next several hours passed in a blur of exhausting labor. The barn couldn't be saved, but they managed to prevent the fire from spreading to the main house or the bunkhouse. The horses had been turned loose before the fire got too intense, and most of them were rounded up by dawn, though 2 were found to have bullet wounds that required Doc Morrison's attention when he arrived at first light. The wounded were tended to with what medical supplies they had on hand. The most seriously injured man, one of the Bar T riders who'd taken a bullet through the thigh, was stabilized enough to survive until Doc Morrison could give him proper surgical care. The dead raiders were wrapped in canvas and laid in a row near what was left of the barn, awaiting burial or identification or whatever the territorial marshal decided to do with them. As the sun rose on a new day, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of pink and gold, the full extent of the damage became clear. The barn was a blackened shell, still smoldering in places, reduced to charred beams and ash. The chicken coop was similarly destroyed. Bullet holes pocked the walls of the house and bunkhouse. Fence rails were shattered. The yard was torn up from horses' hooves and littered with spent brass casings. But they'd held. The ranch still stood. The people who mattered most were still alive. And somewhere out in the darkness, Frank Barker had fled with his diminished gang. His revenge attempt turned into yet another defeat. Scarlett stood on the porch as the sun climbed higher, watching the smoke rise from the ruins of the barn, and felt the exhaustion of the night finally catching up with her. She'd been operating on adrenaline for hours, but now that the immediate danger had passed, her body was demanding rest. Jesse found her there, looking equally exhausted but unable or unwilling to stop moving. "You should get some sleep," he said, his voice rough from smoke inhalation and shouting orders all night. "So should you." "I will. But first I need to check on the perimeter one more time, make sure there's no chance of another attack." "Jesse, you're dead on your feet. Let Jack handle it. He's had more rest than you." But even as she said it, Scarlett knew he wouldn't listen. Jesse was the foreman, and the foreman didn't rest while his men were still working, still watching, still putting their lives on the line. It was part of what made him good at his job, but it was also the kind of stubborn pride that could get a man killed if he wasn't careful. Before she could argue further, Henry came out of the house with Tom Billings, the young rider who'd surrendered. The boy looked better now. Maria had cleaned and bandaged his wound, fed him, and apparently given him one of her legendary lectures about the wages of sin and the importance of choosing your associates carefully. His face still showed the strain of what he'd been through, but there was also a kind of relief there, as if surrendering had lifted a weight he'd been carrying. "Tom here has agreed to tell us everything he knows about Frank Barker's operation," Henry said.
Figured you and Jesse should hear this.
They gathered around one of the tables that had been dragged out into the yard for the wounded to rest on during the night. Tom Billings sat on one end, his wounded arm cradled against his chest, while Henry, Jesse, Scarlett, and Jack Crawford stood or sat around him, listening intently as he spoke. The story that emerged was both enlightening and disturbing. Frank Barker, it seemed, had been planning his revenge against the Hayes Ranch for days, building his fury into an obsession. He'd recruited additional men to replace those killed or captured in the first battle, promising them rich rewards from the plunder of a successful ranch. He'd scouted the property multiple times, mapped out the defenses, planned his attack for maximum destructive impact. But the attack hadn't gone according to plan. The defenses had been stronger than Barker expected, the resistance more organized, the casualties among his men higher than he could sustain. He'd fled north with maybe 5 or 6 men, his gang effectively broken, his reputation in tatters. "He was raving when we retreated," Tom said quietly, "saying he'd come back, that he'd kill everyone, that he'd burn the entire territory if that's what it took to make you pay. But most of the men, they were done. They'd had enough. Frank might want revenge, but he doesn't have the soldiers to get it anymore." "Where was he heading?" Jesse asked. "North toward Wyoming. Said he knew people up there who'd help him rebuild. But I don't think he will rebuild. I think he's finished, and he just doesn't know it yet." Henry nodded slowly, processing this information. "The territorial marshal will want to hear all of this. You cooperate fully with him, answer all his questions honestly, and I'll put in a word for you. You're young, you made a stupid choice, but you're also smart enough to know when to quit. That counts for something." Relief flooded Tom's face. "Thank you, sir. I know I don't deserve any mercy, but I'm grateful for it." As Henry led Tom back toward the house to write out a formal statement, Scarlett finally allowed herself to believe that it might actually be over. Frank Barker was broken, his gang scattered, his threat neutralized. There would still be work to do, rebuilding, healing, dealing with the legal aftermath, but the immediate danger had passed. She turned to Jesse, intending to suggest again that he get some rest, and was shocked to see how pale he'd become. He was swaying slightly on his feet, one hand pressed to his wounded side, his jaw clenched against obvious pain. "Jesse?" She moved quickly to his side, supporting him as his knees buckled slightly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he managed, but his voice was weak and his skin was clammy to the touch. "Just tired." Scarlett pulled aside his shirt and felt her stomach drop. The bandage covering his bullet wound was soaked through with fresh blood. The combination of the hard nights fighting and his refusal to rest had reopened the wound, and he'd been bleeding for who knew how long without saying anything. "Jack, help me!" she called, and the bar T foreman was there immediately, taking Jesse's other arm and helping to support him. "Stubborn fool," Jack muttered, but there was affection in his voice. Same in the war, always pushing past his limits. They got Jesse into the house and onto the sofa where he'd recovered before, though this time the situation was more serious. The wound was bleeding freely now, the stitches Scarlett had so carefully placed torn open by exertion and stress. Maria appeared with fresh bandages and that bottle of whiskey that seemed to be a permanent fixture of frontier medical care, and Scarlett found herself once again cleaning and stitching Jesse's wound while he gritted his teeth against the pain. "You should have said something," she told him, her hand steady despite the fear curling in her chest. "You should have told someone you were bleeding." "Couldn't," Jesse said through gritted teeth. "Had to make sure everyone was safe first. You won't do anyone any good if you bleed to death trying to be heroic." "Not trying to be heroic, just doing my job." Scarlett wanted to argue, wanted to lecture him about the difference between dedication and stupidity, but all her attention was focused on the wound beneath her hands. It looked angry and inflamed, the edges raw where the stitches had torn free. She cleaned it as gently as she could, then began the painstaking process of restitching. Her needlework smaller and more careful this time, reinforcing the closure with more sutures than before. Jesse bore it stoically, his hand white-knuckled where it gripped the edge of the sofa, sweat beading on his forehead. Once, when Scarlett's needle went particularly deep, he couldn't suppress a sharp intake of breath, and she paused. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Not your fault," he managed. "My own damn stubborn pride." "Yes, it is your damn stubborn pride," she agreed, resuming her work. "And if you ever do something like this again, if you ever hide an injury or push yourself past your limits without telling someone, I will personally shoot you myself. Understood?" Despite the pain, Jesse's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. "Understood." By the time she finished, full morning had arrived. The ranch yard was bustling with activity as men worked to clear debris and begin the process of assessing and repairing damage. Doc Morrison had arrived and was tending to the more seriously wounded, his capable hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd stitched up more bullet wounds than he cared to count. Scarlett sat beside Jesse as he finally, reluctantly, allowed exhaustion to claim him. His eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even, his face peaceful in sleep despite the pain he must be feeling. She'd bandaged his wound more securely this time, wrapping the cloth tight enough to prevent the bleeding but not so tight as to impair circulation. "You love him very much," Maria said softly, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "I do," Scarlett admitted, accepting one of the cups gratefully. "More than I thought possible to love someone I've known for such a relatively short time." The heart does not measure time the way the mind does. The heart knows what it knows, regardless of calendars or propriety or what other people might think. Maria sipped her own coffee. "He loves you too. I see it in how he looks at you, how he fights to protect you, how even wounded and exhausted he still tries to make sure you are safe before he rests." "He's an idiot," Scarlett said, but there was no heat in the words, only affection. Most men are, when it comes to the women they love. They think they must always be strong, always be the protector, always sacrifice themselves. It is how they show love, even when it is foolish. Maria paused. "Your father was the same way with your mother. Nearly got himself killed a dozen times trying to prove he could provide for her, protect her, give her the life she deserved. Your mother, she finally told him that what she deserved was a husband who lived to old age, not a martyred hero who died young, trying to be perfect." Scarlett smiled at that, imagining her parents having that conversation. Did it work? Did he stop taking foolish risks? Mostly, though he still had his moments. Maria finished her coffee and stood. "I must help Doc Morrison with the wounded. You stay here with your Jesse, make sure he rests properly this time. And Scarlett? When he wakes up, tell him how you feel. Tell him everything. Life is too short and too uncertain to leave important things unsaid." After Maria left, Scarlett sat in the quiet of the front room, listening to Jesse breathe, watching the morning light creep across the floor, and thought about everything that had happened in the past 4 days. A lifetime of change compressed into less than a week. battle and blood, love confessed and accepted, death faced and survived. She'd killed men, saved a man, discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She'd looked into the eyes of someone she loved and seen that love reflected back at her with an intensity that still made her breath catch. The world outside the windows was the same Colorado territory it had always been, beautiful and brutal, wild and unforgiving, full of danger and possibility in equal measure. But Scarlett felt fundamentally changed by what she'd experienced, as if she'd shed an old skin and emerged as someone new, someone stronger, someone more fully herself than she'd ever been before. When Jesse finally woke in the early afternoon, the first thing he saw was Scarlett sitting beside him, and the smile that lit his face made all the fear and worry of the past hours worth it. "You're still here," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Where else would I be? Running the ranch, managing the accounts, doing any of the 1,000 things that need doing after a night like last night. Those things can wait. You couldn't." She reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Jesse, I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll stop trying to be invincible. Promise me you'll ask for help when you need it, that you'll admit when you're hurt or tired or overwhelmed. Promise me that you'll let the people who love you actually help you sometimes, instead of trying to shoulder every burden alone." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face. "That's a hard promise for me to make. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, being the one others depend on. I don't know if I know how to be any other way." "Then learn. Because I can't watch you kill yourself trying to be strong enough for everyone else. I need you alive, Jesse Carter. I need you whole and healthy, and here with me, not bleeding out because you were too proud or too dedicated to admit you needed help." "You need me?" He said it wonderingly, as if the concept was foreign to him. "I need you. I love you. And I'm choosing you, if you'll have me. Not despite your stubbornness or your dedication or your infuriating tendency to put everyone else first, but because of all those things and 1,000 others. You're the best man I've ever known, Jesse, and I want to spend whatever time we're given building a life with you." Jesse pulled her down to him, kissing her with a gentle intensity that made her heart soar. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I'm yours," he said simply. "For as long as you'll have me, in whatever way you'll have me, I'm yours, Scarlett Hayes." Outside, life on the ranch continued its relentless forward motion. There would be much to do in the coming days and weeks, rebuilding what had burned, healing what had broken, dealing with the legal aftermath of 2 battles and too many dead. But in that moment, in the quiet of the front room, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the promise of a shared future hanging in the air between them, Scarlett allowed herself to simply be happy. They had survived. They had found each other. And whatever came next, they would face it together. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The afternoon sun was climbing higher when Henry Hayes walked into the front room and found his daughter and his foreman sitting close together on the sofa, hands intertwined, speaking in the low, intimate tones of people who'd just made promises to each other. He cleared his throat softly, and they looked up with expressions that were equal parts guilty and defiant, like children caught doing something they knew would raise eyebrows but had no intention of stopping. "Don't let me interrupt," Henry said, though his tone suggested they should definitely let him interrupt. "But the territorial marshal just rode in with 12 men. He's got questions, and he's not the patient type. Jesse, he'll want to talk to you about the defense last night. Scarlett, he'll probably want your statement as well, given you were here for both attacks." Jesse started to push himself up from the sofa, wincing as the movement pulled at his freshly stitched wound. Scarlett immediately put a hand on his arm, restraining him. "You're not going anywhere," she said firmly. "If the marshal wants to talk to you, he can come in here and do it while you're resting." "Scarlett, I can't receive the territorial marshal while lying on a sofa like some invalid." "You can and you will. Papa, tell him." Henry's mouth twitched with suppressed amusement. "I'm staying out of this particular argument. You two work it out amongst yourselves. I'll go stall the marshal for a few minutes, give you time to make yourselves presentable." He paused at the door, his expression growing more serious. "But Jesse, she's right. You lost blood last night and this morning. You need rest, not pride. The marshal will understand."
After Henry left, Jesse looked at Scarlett with a mixture of exasperation and affection. "You're going to be like this, aren't you? Constantly telling me what's good for me, making me rest when I should be working, generally being a nuisance about my health and welfare." "Absolutely, for the rest of your life, if you'll let me." "Then I suppose I'll have to get used to it." He settled back against the cushions with a sigh that was more contentment than resignation. "Though I reserve the right to occasionally ignore your very sensible advice and do foolish things anyway. As long as those foolish things don't involve bleeding quietly while pretending everything's fine. No promises." Before Scarlett could respond to that infuriating statement, the front door opened and the territorial marshal entered, followed by Henry and two of his deputies. The marshal looked like he'd aged a decade since his last visit. His face was lined with exhaustion, his clothes dusty from hard riding, and his eyes held the weary frustration of a man trying to maintain order in a territory that seemed determined to descend into chaos. "Mr. Carter," the marshal said, removing his hat and nodding respectfully, "heard you took a wound defending this place. How bad is it?" "Not bad enough to keep me from answering questions, sir," Jesse replied, though he didn't attempt to stand. The marshal pulled up a chair and sat heavily, producing a worn notebook and a pencil stub from his coat pocket. "Then let's get to it. I need a full account of last night's attack, timing, number of attackers, their tactics, casualties on both sides, everything you can remember." What followed was an intensive interrogation that lasted over an hour. The marshal was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about every aspect of the attack, cross-referencing Jesse's answers with statements he'd already taken from other defenders, building a comprehensive picture of what had happened. He was particularly interested in the young rider who'd surrendered, and when Henry brought Tom Billings in to corroborate parts of the story, the marshal questioned him extensively about Frank Barker's current whereabouts and state of mind. "From what I'm hearing," the marshal finally said, closing his notebook with an air of grim satisfaction, "Frank Barker's finished. He's lost too many men, burned too many bridges. Word's already spreading across the territory about how a single ranch held off his gang twice and handed him his head both times. No self-respecting outlaw is going to want to ride with him after that. He's more liability than asset now." "But he's still out there," Scarlett pointed out. "Still angry, still dangerous. For now. But I've got wanted posters going up in every town from here to the Canadian border. $500 reward, dead or alive. Someone will turn him in or gun him down within a month, mark my words. Men like Frank Barker, once they start losing, they keep losing until someone puts them in the ground." The marshal stood, tucking his notebook away. "In the meantime, I'm leaving 2 of my deputies here for the next week, just to be safe. After that, you should be clear." After the marshal and his entourage left, taking Tom Billings with them to face trial, and hopefully a lenient sentence in exchange for his cooperation, the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet. The adrenaline that had sustained everyone through the night's violence had finally burned away, leaving only bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Men stumbled off to the bunkhouse to sleep for 12 or 14 hours straight. Doc Morrison finished with the wounded and departed with promises to return the next day to check on their recovery. Even Maria, who seemed to possess limitless reserves of energy, retired to her room for a rare afternoon rest. Scarlett found herself alone with Jesse again, the house quiet around them, the afternoon light slanting through the windows in golden bars that illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. She'd barely slept in 3 days, and now that the immediate crises had passed, exhaustion was catching up with her as well. "You should sleep," Jessie said, watching her eyes droop despite her efforts to stay alert. "So should you." "I've been sleeping on and off all day. You've been running on nerves and determination since yesterday morning." It was true, and Scarlett was too tired to argue. She settled into the chair beside the sofa, intending to rest for just a few minutes, but within moments she was sound asleep, her head tilted at an awkward angle that would definitely result in a stiff neck when she woke. Jesse watched her sleep for a long moment, his expression soft with affection and something deeper, something that looked like wonder. That this remarkable woman had chosen him, of all people, seemed almost too good to be true. He was a ranch hand with nothing to his name except his horse, his rifle, and his reputation for honest work. She was educated, cultured, the daughter of a successful rancher, a woman who could have had her pick of suitors from Denver to San Francisco. Yet she'd looked at him and seen something worth loving.
She'd fought beside him, stitched his wounds, declared her feelings with a directness that had taken his breath away. And now here she was, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair because she refused to leave his side even though she was clearly exhausted. Jesse knew in that moment, with absolute certainty, that he was going to marry this woman if she'd have him. Not right away. There were proprieties to observe, arrangements to make, a proper proposal to plan. But soon. As soon as the ranch recovered from the attacks, as soon as he'd proven himself worthy of being her husband and not just her father's foreman, he would ask her to be his wife. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. He must have dozed off himself, because the next thing he knew, the light had shifted and voices were coming from the kitchen. Maria and Henry, discussing dinner preparations and the work schedule for tomorrow. Jesse shifted carefully, testing his wound, and was relieved to find that while it still hurt, the pain was manageable and there was no fresh bleeding. In the chair beside him, Scarlett stirred and opened her eyes, blinking groggily. When she saw him watching her, she smiled, a sleepy, unguarded expression that made his heart clench. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "Couple of hours, I think. The light's different." She stretched, wincing as her neck protested. "I feel like I've been run over by a stampede." "You look like it, too." "Charming." But she was smiling as she said it, and Jesse grinned back, enjoying this easy banter that felt natural despite the intensity of everything they'd been through. The smell of cooking meat wafted from the kitchen, and Jesse's stomach growled loudly enough to make Scarlett laugh. "When did you last eat?" she asked. "Yesterday sometime? It's all kind of blurred together." "Then let's get some food in you. Maria will have my hide if I let you waste away from hunger after she went to all the trouble of stitching you back together twice." They made their way to the kitchen, Jesse moving slowly but steadily, his strength clearly returning now that he'd had proper rest. Maria had prepared a feast despite her own exhaustion, roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from the garden that had miraculously survived the attack unscathed. Henry was already at the table, and he gestured for them to join him. The meal was quiet, all of them too tired for extensive conversation, but there was a comfortable quality to the silence. They were survivors sharing a meal, people who'd been through hell together and come out the other side. The food tasted better than it had any right to, the way everything tastes better when you've recently been reminded that you might never taste anything again. "I sent word to the bar tea," Henry said, sopping up gravy with a piece of bread. "Told Thomas that his men were heroes, that we couldn't have held without them. He sent back word that Jack Crawford and the others can stay as long as we need them, no charge for their time. Good neighbors are worth their weight in gold in this territory." "We'll need to rebuild the barn," Jesse said, his mind already moving to practical matters. "And the chicken coop, repair the fence damage, replace the burned section of roof on the bunkhouse." "All of that can wait a few days," Henry said firmly. "Right now, everyone needs to heal. The cattle aren't going anywhere, and we've got enough shelter for the horses and the lean-to behind the house. Take some time, let your wound finish healing properly, let the men recover. The work will still be there in a week." It was sound advice, and Jesse knew it, but accepting it went against every instinct he had. He was the foreman. He was supposed to be the one organizing the work, leading by example, proving his worth through constant effort. Resting felt like shirking, like letting people down. Scarlett, reading his thoughts in his expression, reached under the table and squeezed his hand. "The ranch didn't fall apart while you were lying wounded on that sofa all afternoon. It won't fall apart if you take a few more days to heal properly. Trust the men to do their jobs. Trust Papa to make good decisions. Trust yourself to know when you need to rest." "Listen to her," Maria said from the stove where she was preparing coffee. "That girl has more sense than any 3 men I've known. You would be wise to heed her advice, especially if you plan to make her your wife someday." The kitchen went very quiet. Henry's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Scarlett's eyes went wide. Jesse felt heat rise in his face, caught between mortification at having his intentions announced so publicly and gratitude that Maria had opened the door to a conversation he'd been trying to figure out how to start. Maria, completely unrepentant, set coffee cups on the table with a satisfied air. "What? You think I am blind? You think I do not see how you look at each other, how you speak of the future as something you will face together? This is not news to anyone in this house." Henry set down his fork deliberately, his weathered face thoughtful. Is this true, Jesse? Are you planning to ask for my daughter's hand? Jesse met the older man's eyes steadily, refusing to show the nervousness churning in his gut. I am, sir. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. I love Scarlett, and she's said she loves me. I know I'm just a ranch hand. Foreman, Henry corrected, and a damn good one. You've proven your worth 100 times over, and especially in the last few days. Any man who'd throw himself in front of a bullet for my daughter has already passed the most important test there is. He paused, then smiled, a genuine expression of warmth and approval. You have my blessing, Jesse Carter, though I suspect Scarlett would marry you with or without it. I absolutely would, Scarlett confirmed, her voice firm despite the emotion shining in her eyes. But I'm glad I don't have to choose between the two most important men in my life. Maria set down the coffee pot with a satisfied thump. Good. Now that is settled. We can speak openly about wedding plans. I am thinking a ceremony in the spring, when the wildflowers are blooming and the weather is— Maria, Scarlett interrupted, laughing despite herself. He hasn't even proposed yet. A formality. The hard part is already done. You have chosen each other. Your father has given his blessing, and neither of you is foolish enough to let propriety or convention stand in the way of happiness. The proposal will come when it comes. In the meantime, there is no harm in planning. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. Speculation about when the new barn should be built and how big it should be, discussion of which cattle needed to be moved to different pastures once the fencing was repaired, stories about neighbors and friends, and the small dramas of frontier life that continued regardless of attacks and violence. It felt almost normal, almost like any other family dinner, and Scarlett found herself grateful for that normalcy after days of constant tension. After dinner, she and Jesse walked out to the front porch, seeking the coolness of the evening air. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in those spectacular shades of orange and purple that made Colorado sunsets famous throughout the territories. In the ruins of the barn, a few embers still glowed faintly, but the fire itself had long since burned out. This is really happening, isn't it? Scarlett said softly, leaning against the porch rail. Us, I mean. We're really doing this. Jesse stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Having second thoughts? Not even for a moment. I'm just trying to process how much has changed in less than a week. 6 days ago, I was standing in my father's store, watching the horizon, and feeling like nothing in my life would ever change. Now I've fought in 2 battles, killed men, nearly died, fallen in love, and apparently I'm getting married in the spring, whether I'm properly proposed to or not. About that. Jesse turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. I know this isn't the romantic proposal you probably imagined when you were a girl. I don't have a ring yet, and we're both exhausted and standing in front of a burned barn with the smell of smoke still in the air. But I don't want to wait, Scarlett. I don't want to follow some script about what's proper or expected. I just want to ask you directly, honestly, the way we've been with each other from the start. Scarlett's heart was suddenly pounding, her breath catching in her throat. Jesse, will you marry me? He asked simply. Will you be my wife, my partner, my best friend for whatever time we're given? Will you build a life with me here on this ranch, raise children with me if we're blessed with them, grow old beside me while we watch the Colorado sunsets and count ourselves lucky to have found each other in this wild, beautiful, dangerous territory? Tears were streaming down Scarlett's face, but she was smiling, her joy so intense it felt like it might burst out of her chest. Yes, she said, her voice breaking on the word. Yes, absolutely yes. I'll marry you, Jesse Carter, and I'll count myself the luckiest woman in the entire West. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, his hands gentle on her face, tasting of coffee and promise, and the future they'd just committed to building together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the last light of sunset was fading from the sky, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I'll get you a ring, Jesse promised. A proper one, with a stone and everything, soon as I can get to Denver, or— I don't need a ring, Scarlett interrupted. I mean, I won't say no to one eventually, but I don't need it to know we're engaged. I have your word, and you have mine. That's enough. You deserve more than just my word. You deserve everything I can possibly give you. Then give me yourself. That's all I want, Jesse. Just you, exactly as you are. They stood together on the porch as full darkness settled over the ranch, holding each other close, speaking in low murmurs about their plans and their hopes, and all the ordinary, extraordinary dreams that young couples have been sharing since the beginning of time. They talked about where they'd live, probably in the ranch house at first, then maybe building a place of their own on the eastern pasture where the view was particularly beautiful. They talked about children, about how many they hoped to have and what they'd teach them. They talked about the ranch and how they'd run it together, combining Scarlett's head for business with Jesse's practical knowledge of cattle and horses and land management. Henry found them there an hour later, still talking, still dreaming, completely absorbed in each other and the future they were planning. He watched them for a moment from the doorway, thinking about his own late wife and the similar conversations they'd had in this exact spot 30 years ago, and felt a complex mixture of joy and melancholy. "You two planning to stand out here all night?" he asked, making his presence known. They turned, both smiling, both glowing with happiness that was visible even in the darkness. "Jesse asked me to marry him," Scarlett announced, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "And I said yes." "I know." Maria had her ear pressed to the window the whole time. "She's inside right now planning your wedding down to the last detail, and Lord help anyone who tries to stop her." Henry's expression softened. "But I'm glad, truly glad. You're good for each other. Anyone can see that. Your mother would have loved Jesse, Scarlett. She always said you'd need a man who was strong enough to stand beside you without trying to stand in front of you. I think you've found that man." "I have," Scarlett agreed, looking at Jesse with undisguised love. "I really have." The next few days passed in a blur of recovery and reconstruction. True to his word, Henry insisted that everyone take time to heal before beginning the major repair work, so the pace of ranch life slowed to something almost leisurely. Men slept late, ate well, tended their wounds and their horses, and gradually regained the strength that the battles had depleted. Jesse's wound healed cleanly this time, thanks to Scarlett's careful nursing and his own reluctant acceptance that he needed to rest. By the 5th day after the second attack, he was moving normally again, the injury reduced to a dull ache that he could ignore most of the time. The scar would be prominent, a permanent reminder of the night he'd pushed Scarlett out of the path of a bullet, but he wore it without complaint. The 2 deputies the marshal had left behind proved to be good company and useful helpers. They were both young men, one barely out of his teens, and they were eager to learn about ranch work during their downtime. Jesse found himself teaching them the basics of cattle handling and fence repair, and their enthusiasm reminded him of his own early days working ranches, before experience had taught him caution and the war had taught him the cost of violence. On the 6th day, a rider arrived from town with news that sent a ripple of relief through the ranch. Frank Barker had been found dead in a ravine 50 miles north, apparently thrown from his horse and killed when he struck his head on a rock. Whether it had been an accident or whether one of his remaining men had decided that the bounty on his head was worth more than loyalty, no one could say for certain. But either way, the threat was over. The Barker gang was finished. "Seems almost anticlimactic," Jack Crawford observed as they heard the news. All that build-up, all that fear about when he'd come back, and then he just dies falling off a horse. "Sometimes that's how it goes," Jesse said. "In the war, I knew men who survived dozens of battles, only to die from infected cuts or falls from wagons, or plain old bad luck. Death doesn't always come dramatically. Sometimes it's just random and pointless." Glad it came for him before it came for any more of us, though. Jesse couldn't argue with that sentiment. With the threat definitively ended, the Bar T riders prepared to return to their own ranch. Jack Crawford pulled Jesse aside before they left, clasping his hand in a firm grip. "You did good work here," Jack said. "Real good work. If you ever need help, if you ever find yourself in trouble, you send word to the Bar T and we'll come running. You've earned that, and more besides." "Appreciate it," Jesse replied. "And the same goes for you. Hayes Ranch stands ready to help Bar T if the need arises." As the Bar T riders departed, Scarlett came to stand beside Jesse, watching them disappear down the road toward town. "We're going to have good neighbors," she observed. "That's worth almost as much as good land. Your father built those relationships over years. That's the kind of reputation that matters out here, not how much land you own or how many cattle you run, but whether people trust you enough to ride to your aid when trouble comes." And we proved we're worth that trust. We held against the Barker gang twice. Word of that will spread. Other ranchers will know that the Hayes place is solid, that we don't break under pressure. Jesse looked at her, this remarkable woman who thought strategically about reputation and alliances while also being capable of handling a rifle and stitching wounds and running a household. "You're going to be an amazing ranch owner someday," he said. "We're going to be amazing ranch owners," she corrected. "Together. That's how this works now, remember? We're partners." The repair work began in earnest on the 7th day. With the immediate threat gone and the wounded recovered enough to work, Henry organized the men into crews to tackle the various projects. The barn was the biggest job. The entire structure would need to be rebuilt from the foundation up. Jesse took charge of that project, working alongside the men to clear away the burned debris and begin laying the groundwork for the new building. It was hard, physical labor, the kind that left you exhausted and satisfied at the end of each day. There was something deeply therapeutic about it, too, about transforming destruction into construction, replacing what had been lost with something new and potentially even better. The new barn would be larger than the old one, with better ventilation and more secure stalls. It would be a monument to resilience, proof that the ranch could survive attacks and emerge stronger. Scarlett spent her days managing the business side of the ranch, ordering supplies, paying bills, corresponding with buyers about fall cattle sales. But she also found time to help with the physical work, surprising some of the ranch hands with her willingness to haul lumber and hammer nails alongside them. Jesse watched her work with a mixture of pride and amusement. She was terrible at carpentry, but she attacked each task with such determination that even her mistakes were endearing. "You're supposed to hit the nail, not your thumb," he pointed out one afternoon after watching her miss 3 times in a row. "I'm aware of that, thank you very much. The nail just keeps moving." "The nail isn't moving. Your aim is just terrible." She glared at him, but there was laughter in her eyes. "If you're so much better at this, why don't you do it?" "Because watching you curse at inanimate objects is vastly more entertaining." She threw a bent nail at him, which he caught easily, and they both dissolved into laughter. It was moments like these, Scarlett thought, that she'd remember when she was old. Not just the grand dramatic events, but these small, perfect moments of shared joy in the midst of ordinary work. As August faded into September and the heat of summer began giving way to the crisp coolness of early autumn, the ranch gradually returned to normal. The new barn rose timber by timber, the fences were repaired, the cattle were moved to fresh pastures, and life settled into its familiar rhythms. The burned sections of ground began to show signs of new growth, grass pushing up through the ash, nature's way of healing the scars of violence. Jesse made good on his promise to get Scarlett a proper engagement ring. He rode to Denver one weekend, a 3-day round trip, and returned with a simple gold band set with a small but brilliant sapphire that matched the color of Colorado summer skies. When he slipped it onto her finger during a quiet moment on the front porch, watching another spectacular sunset, Scarlett felt her eyes fill with tears. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." "The jeweler tried to sell me something bigger, more expensive. But this one reminded me of you, elegant and simple and absolutely right. Plus, the color matched your eyes." "My eyes are green." "Are they? I could have sworn they were blue." She hit his arm playfully, but she was smiling, turning her hand to watch the sapphire catch the fading light. "I love it. I love you. Thank you." They set a date for the wedding, April 15th, when the wildflowers would be blooming on the hillsides and the weather would be mild enough for an outdoor ceremony. Maria immediately began planning in earnest, drafting guest lists and menu options, and arguing with Henry about how much whiskey would be appropriate to serve. Watching the older woman throw herself into wedding preparations with such enthusiasm, Scarlett felt a wave of affection for this makeshift family that had formed around her. Her father, Maria, Jesse, the ranch hands who'd become like brothers, the neighbors who'd proven themselves true friends. This was what mattered, she realized. Not wealth or status or meeting society's expectations, but this. People who cared about each other, who showed up when needed, who celebrated joys and shared sorrows, and built something lasting together. One evening in late September, as the last light was fading from the sky and the temperature was dropping toward the first frost of the season, Scarlett and Jesse took a walk to the eastern pasture, to the spot they'd picked out for their future home. From here, you could see for miles the ranch buildings below, the town of Crimson Creek in the distance, the mountains rising like sentinels against the horizon. "We could build right here," Jesse said, gesturing to a level spot near a grove of aspens. "Close enough to the main house to be convenient, far enough away to have our own space. Good water access from that creek, and the view." He trailed off, looking out over the landscape that would be their home. "It's perfect," Scarlett agreed. "We could have windows facing west to catch the sunset, a porch where we can sit in the evenings, maybe a garden for vegetables and herbs, a stable for our horses, a workshop where I can do repairs, room to expand when the children come." They stood together in the gathering darkness, hands joined, hearts full, dreaming aloud about the life they'd build in this place. Neither of them mentioned the violence that had marked the beginning of their acknowledged love, though both carried the memories and the scars. Some things were too big to talk about, too complex to put into words. But they didn't need to discuss it. They'd lived through it together, survived it together, and that shared experience had forged a bond that words couldn't strengthen or weaken. "Do you ever think about the men we killed?" Scarlett asked quietly. "Wonder who they were? What brought them to that point?" "Sometimes," Jesse admitted, "but not as much as I used to. I've learned that you can't carry that weight forever, or it'll crush you. They made their choices, we made ours, and we all have to live or die with the consequences. That's just how it is." "Do you think we'll have to fight again? Defend this place against other threats?" "Maybe. This is still wild country, still being settled and claimed and fought over. There'll be other challenges, other dangers. But we'll face them the same way we faced the Barker gang, together, prepared, refusing to give up what's ours." Scarlett squeezed his hand, drawing comfort from his strength and certainty. "Together," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." As they walked back toward the ranch house, following the familiar path through the darkness, they could see lamplight glowing in the windows like promises of warmth and safety. Maria would have dinner waiting, Henry would be reading his newspaper by the fire, and their future would be waiting for them to step into it. The past week had changed them both in ways large and small. They'd discovered reserves of courage they hadn't known they possessed, had learned that love could grow even in the midst of violence and fear, had proven to themselves and each other that they were capable of facing whatever challenges the frontier threw at them. But more than that, they'd chosen each other. In a world where so many things were uncertain and beyond their control, that choice stood as an anchor, a fixed point around which everything else could revolve. Whatever came next, and in a territory as wild as Colorado in 1874, plenty would come. They'd face it as partners, as equals, as two people who'd looked into the darkness together and emerged into the light, hand in hand. That night, as Scarlett lay in her bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down for sleep, she touched the sapphire ring on her finger and smiled into the darkness. 6 months ago, if someone had told her she'd fight in 2 pitched battles, kill several men, fall deeply in love with her father's foreman, and get engaged all in the span of a single week, she would have thought they were mad. But that was the frontier for you. It compressed lifetimes into moments, forced people to become their best or worst selves, offered no guarantees except that nothing would ever be boring. You could live safe and small, or you could reach for more and risk everything. Scarlett had never been one for safe and small, and neither had Jesse. They were well matched, she thought drowsily, as sleep began to claim her. 2 stubborn, capable people who'd found each other against the odds, who'd chosen to build rather than simply survive, who'd looked at the vast, dangerous, beautiful Colorado territory and decided it was exactly where they belonged. In the morning, there would be work to do. There was always work to do on a ranch. The new barn would need more timber, the cattle would need checking, the accounts would need updating, and 1,000 other tasks large and small would demand attention. But there would also be moments of joy, shared smiles across the breakfast table, hands touching as they passed each other in the yard, the quiet contentment of building something together. This was life, real and messy and infinitely precious. This was home. And somewhere in his bunk in the foreman's quarters, Jesse Carter was lying awake thinking similar thoughts, touching his own ring, a simple band Scarlett had given him to match her sapphire, a symbol of promises made and futures imagined. They'd survived the fire. Now came the living, and that was an adventure all its own. The weeks following their engagement passed in a golden haze of autumn, the kind of perfect Colorado fall that made people forget how brutal the winters could be. The aspens turned brilliant gold on the hillsides. The air took on that crisp quality that made every breath feel like a blessing, and the ranch hummed with productive energy as everyone worked to complete the major repairs before the first snow. Jesse's fever came on suddenly one morning in early October, 3 weeks after Scarlett had restitched his wound. He'd been fine at breakfast, joking with the ranch hands and planning the day's work on the nearly completed barn. But by mid-morning, when Scarlett brought coffee out to the work crew, she found him sitting on a stack of lumber with his head in his hands, his face flushed and his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool temperature. "Jesse?" She set down the coffee pot and moved quickly to his side. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said automatically, but his voice was weak and his eyes were unfocused. "Just felt dizzy for a moment. I'll be fine." Scarlett pressed her hand to his forehead and felt her stomach drop. He was burning up, his skin radiating heat like a stove. "You're not fine. You're burning with fever. How long have you been feeling poorly?" "I don't know. An hour, maybe. Woke up feeling a little off, but I thought it would pass." He tried to stand and swayed dangerously, forcing Scarlett to grab his arm to steady him. "Jack," she called to Crawford, who was working on the barn roof. "Get down here. Jesse's sick." What followed was organized chaos as the men helped Jesse back to the house, his condition deteriorating rapidly with each passing minute. By the time they got him inside and onto the sofa, that same sofa that had become his sickbed twice before, he was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently and shaking with chills despite the fever that was cooking him from the inside out. Maria took one look at him and immediately began issuing orders. "Heat water, bring clean cloths, someone ride for Doc Morrison, and fetch my medicine box from the kitchen, the large one, not the small." Henry appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, and disappeared again without a word. Scarlett heard him shouting for someone to saddle the fastest horse and ride to town at top speed. "What's happening?" Scarlett asked Maria, fear making her voice sharp. "He was fine this morning. How can someone go from fine to this sick so quickly?" Maria was already examining Jesse's wound, carefully unwrapping the bandages Scarlett had changed just the day before. When the injury was exposed, both women inhaled sharply. The wound was angry red and swollen, with visible streaks of infection radiating from it. The edges that had been healing cleanly now oozed a foul-smelling discharge. "Infection," Maria said grimly. "Deep infection. It must have been building for days, hidden beneath the surface. Now it has spread to his blood." She looked up at Scarlett, her dark eyes serious. "This is very dangerous, Mija. Blood poisoning can kill quickly. We must fight the fever and clean the infection, and we must do it now." Scarlett felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Blood poisoning. She'd heard of it, had seen men die from it when minor wounds turned septic, and the infection spread through their bodies like wildfire. It was often a death sentence, especially out here where proper medical care was scarce and antibiotics didn't exist. "Tell me what to do," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the terror churning in her gut. What followed were the longest hours of Scarlett's life. Maria worked with the focused intensity of a battlefield surgeon, cleaning the infected wound with solutions that made Jesse scream even in his fevered delirium, packing it with poultices made from herbs whose names Scarlett didn't know, forcing liquid down his throat when he could swallow, and bathing him with cool water when his temperature spiked so high she feared his brain might cook. Scarlett stayed by his side through all of it, holding his hand when the pain was bad, whispering reassurances when the fever dreams made him call out, refusing to leave even when Maria insisted she needed rest. Henry brought her food she couldn't eat and coffee she drank mechanically, watching his daughter fight for the man she loved with the same fierce determination she'd shown fighting the Barker gang. Doc Morrison arrived in the late afternoon, his medical bag in hand and his face grave when he saw the patient. He examined Jesse thoroughly, asked Maria detailed questions about what treatment she'd already administered, and finally sat back with a troubled expression. "It's bad," he said bluntly. "The infection has spread significantly. He's young and strong, which works in his favor. But this kind of blood poisoning, it's touch and go. If we can break the fever and get the infection under control in the next 12 to 24 hours, he's got a good chance. If we can't..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What else can we do? Scarlett demanded. There has to be something more, some treatment or medicine. We're doing everything that can be done, Doc Morrison said gently. The rest is up to him. His body, his will to fight, his constitution. And maybe a little prayer wouldn't hurt if you're the praying type. Scarlett wasn't particularly religious. Life on the frontier had a way of testing faith until it either strengthened to steel or shattered completely. But that night, as she sat beside Jesse and watched him burn with fever, she prayed. She prayed to her mother's memory, to whatever gods might be listening, to the vast indifferent universe itself. She made bargains and promises, offered trades she had no authority to make, begged for mercy from forces she wasn't even sure existed. And through it all, Jesse fought. In his delirium, he relived the battles, shouted warnings about riders approaching, called out orders to men who weren't there. He spoke to people from his past, his mother who died when he was young, friends lost in the war, the brother he'd mentioned once who'd been killed in a farming accident. He rambled about horses and cattle and the color of sunset on the mountains, and he called for Scarlett. Again and again, her name emerged from his fevered lips, sometimes questioning, sometimes desperate, always searching. I'm here, she told him over and over, gripping his burning hand in both of hers. I'm right here, Jesse. I'm not going anywhere. You hear me? I'm not leaving, and you're not leaving either. We have plans, remember? A house to build, a wedding in April, a whole life ahead of us. You don't get to die on me now. I won't allow it. Maria found her there at midnight, still talking to Jesse, still holding his hand, still refusing to accept the possibility that he might not survive this. You should rest, Maria said gently, even for an hour. I will watch him. I can't. What if he wakes up and I'm not here? What if he needs me and I'm sleeping? Mija, you are exhausted. You will make yourself sick, and then who will care for both of you? Maria put a hand on Scarlett's shoulder. Please, just 1 hour. I promise I will wake you if anything changes. Reluctantly, Scarlett agreed to lie down on the floor beside the sofa, close enough to touch Jesse if she reached up. She didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion claimed her the moment she closed her eyes, dragging her down into darkness. She woke to early morning light and Maria gently shaking her shoulder. For a moment, disoriented and groggy, Scarlett couldn't remember where she was or why she'd been sleeping on the floor. Then memory crashed back and she jerked upright, her eyes immediately going to Jesse. He was still. Too still. For one heart-stopping moment, Scarlett thought she was too late, thought he died while she was sleeping and her last memory of him would be fevered delirium instead of the man she loved. Then she saw his chest rise and fall, steady and deep, and noticed the color in his face. Still pale, but no longer that terrifying flush of uncontrolled fever. The fever broke an hour ago, Maria said, smiling through obvious exhaustion. She'd clearly stayed up all night watching over Jesse. His breathing is easier, the infection seems less angry. Doc Morrison checked him at dawn and said he thinks the crisis has passed. Scarlett moved to the sofa on shaking legs and pressed her hand to Jesse's forehead. Cool. He was cool. The relief was so intense it made her lightheaded, and she had to sit down before her legs gave out entirely. He's going to be all right? She asked, needing to hear it confirmed. I believe so. He still needs rest and careful watching, but yes, I think he will recover. Maria stood with visible effort, every movement showing her own exhaustion. You should let him sleep. His body needs time to heal from fighting the infection. But before Scarlett could respond, Jesse's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused at first, confused, but then they found Scarlett's face, and something like recognition flickered in their blue depths. You stayed, he said, his voice barely above a whisper and rough as gravel. Of course I stayed. Where else would I be? Thought I dreamed you. Thought maybe I died and you were an angel. He tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. Everything hurts. That's because you've been fighting blood poisoning for the last 18 hours. You scared about 10 years off my life, Jesse Carter. Scarlett's voice cracked despite her best efforts to sound stern. Don't you ever do that to me again. Didn't do it on purpose, he protested weakly. Just woke up feeling poorly. You nearly died. Do you understand that? The infection spread to your blood, and Doc Morrison said it was touch and go whether you'd survive.
Tears were streaming down Scarlett's face now, all the fear and stress of the past day finally breaking through. I thought I was going to lose you before we even got to start our life together. I thought, hey. Jesse lifted his hand with obvious effort and wiped at her tears with his thumb. I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. You think a little infection is going to take me down after I survived the Barker gang, a bullet wound, and your cooking? Despite everything, Scarlett laughed through her tears. I'll have you know my cooking is perfectly adequate. If by adequate you mean edible with sufficient whiskey, then yes. His smile was weak but genuine, and seeing it made Scarlett's heart soar. Over the next several days, Jesse recovered slowly but steadily. The infection gradually receded under Maria's continued treatment and Doc Morrison's regular visits. The wound, which had looked so angry and dangerous, began to heal properly this time, the edges closing cleanly without the ominous signs of spreading poison. But the recovery wasn't easy. Jesse ran occasional low fevers that had Scarlett hovering anxiously until they passed. He had nightmares about the fever dreams, waking confused and disoriented until someone reminded him where he was and that he was safe. And he struggled with the enforced idleness, a man used to constant physical work now confined to a sofa while the world continued without him. I should be working on the barn, he fretted on the 4th day of his recovery. Fall's almost over. We need to get it finished before the snow comes. The barn will get finished whether you're hammering nails or not, Scarlett said, sitting beside him with the ranch accounts she'd brought to work on while keeping him company. Jack Crawford's taken over as temporary foreman, and he's doing a fine job. Stop worrying. I'm supposed to be the foreman. It's my responsibility. Right now, your responsibility is to heal properly so you don't end up with another infection that actually kills you this time. She set aside her ledger and took his hand. Jesse, you almost died. Do you understand what that would have done to me? To my father? To everyone on this ranch who cares about you? His expression softened. I know. I'm sorry. It's just hard, lying here useless while everyone else is working. You're not useless. You're recovering. There's a difference. She paused, then decided to voice the fear that had been growing in her heart since the fever crisis. Jesse, I need you to promise me something. What's that? Promise me you'll be more careful about injuries from now on. Promise me you won't hide pain or dismiss symptoms because you think you need to keep working. Promise me that if something feels wrong, you'll say something instead of pushing through until it nearly kills you. Jesse was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face. I promise, he finally said. I can't promise I won't take risks when they're necessary. That's part of living out here, part of protecting what's ours. But I promise I won't be stupid about it, E. I promise I'll tell you when something's wrong, and I'll listen when you tell me I need to rest. That's all I ask. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, Scarlett working on her accounts while Jesse dozed on and off. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the ranch, men working on the barn, horses moving in the corrals, the eternal lowing of cattle. It was the sound of life continuing, of work being done, of a community functioning even when one of its key members was temporarily sidelined. Maria brought lunch around noon, along with a tisane made from herbs that she swore would help Jesse regain his strength. It tasted terrible, but Jesse drank it without complaint, earning an approving nod from the housekeeper. You are learning, Maria said with satisfaction. A wise man knows when to follow the advice of women who know better than him. I'm terrified of what you'll do to me if I don't follow your advice, Jesse corrected, but he was smiling. Ash did, but he was... That too is wisdom. Henry came in that evening with news that the barn was nearly complete. Just the final details remained, and they'd be done within a week at the current pace. He also brought word from town that the territorial governor was recognizing the Hayes Ranch and several others in the area for their role in breaking the Barker gang, with official commendations being prepared for those who'd fought in the battles. Seems you're going to be a certified hero, Henry said to Jesse with wry amusement. The governor wants to present the commendations in person come spring. Make a whole ceremony of it. Jesse looked mortified. That's not necessary. We just did what needed doing. Nevertheless, the territory wants to recognize courage and capability. Apparently there's talk of using what happened here as an example for other ranches,
teaching them how to organize proper defenses against raiders. Henry settled into his chair by the fire. You'll be expected to give a speech or some such nonsense. Absolutely not. I'm a foreman, not a public speaker. You'll do it because the territorial governor isn't someone you say no to, Scarlett interjected. Besides, it might be good for the ranch. Recognition like that could mean better contracts, higher prices for our cattle, more respect in business dealings. Jesse looked at her with betrayed disbelief. You're supposed to be on my side. I am on your side, which is why I'm telling you that standing in front of people and talking for 10 minutes is far less dangerous than anything else you've done in the past month. You'll survive. Henry laughed at Jesse's expression. Son, you might as well learn this now. When Scarlett gets that look in her eye, the one that says she's made a decision and expects you to fall in line, your best option is to surrender gracefully. Trust me on this. Her mother had the same look, and I learned through painful experience that arguing was futile. Over the following week, as Jesse continued to recover and the barn reached completion, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The immediate crises had passed. The Barker gang was destroyed. Jesse's infection was healing. The major repairs were done. What remained was the ordinary work of running a successful cattle operation, work that continued regardless of drama or danger. Scarlett found herself falling into a partnership with Jesse that felt natural despite its newness. They'd started meeting each morning to discuss the day's priorities, with Scarlett handling the business and financial aspects while Jesse managed the physical work and the men. It was an effective division of labor that played to both their strengths, and watching it work smoothly gave Scarlett a glimpse of what their marriage would be like. Two capable people working toward common goals, respecting each other's expertise, building something together that neither could build alone. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as warning that winter was approaching. The new barn was finished just in time, and they held an informal celebration to mark its completion. The structure was beautiful, Scarlett thought, larger and better designed than its predecessor, built with the combined knowledge gained from both the original barn's strengths and the lessons learned from its destruction. It's a good barn, Jesse said, standing beside her and looking up at the finished structure with satisfaction. Your father designed it well. You built it well, Scarlett countered, even while recovering from nearly dying, which I'm still not entirely happy about, by the way. Duly noted. He put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. The gesture was becoming familiar now, natural, this physical affection between them that had once been forbidden by propriety and was now accepted by everyone on the ranch as simply the way things were. Doc Morrison had cleared Jesse for light work a few days earlier, though with stern warnings about not overdoing it and continuing to rest when needed. The wound had healed into a scar, a puckered line of tissue that would mark Jesse's side for the rest of his life. But it was clean and closed. No longer the angry, infected mess it had been during those terrifying days when his life had hung in the balance. As November arrived and the weather turned colder, wedding preparations began in earnest. Maria had recruited several women from town to help with sewing Scarlett's dress, and the front parlor had been transformed into a workshop full of fabric and thread, and the cheerful gossip of women engaged in a shared project. Scarlett endured multiple fittings with as much patience as she could muster, standing still while Maria and her helpers pinned and adjusted and debated the proper length of sleeves. I feel like a dress form, she complained during one particularly long-fitting session. Beauty requires sacrifice, Maria said around a mouthful of pins. Stand still. Jesse, watching from the doorway with barely concealed amusement, earned himself a glare from Scarlett that only made him grin wider. You're enjoying this entirely too much, she told him. I'm enjoying watching you suffer through something you can't shoot or manage your way out of, yes. It's refreshing to see you as uncomfortable as I was during that speech to the ranch hands about proper barn safety procedures you made me give last week. That speech was important. Men needed to know the new safety protocols. I agree. Doesn't mean I enjoyed giving it. He pushed off from the doorframe. If you ladies will excuse me, I've got actual work to do. Unlike some people who get to stand around being made beautiful. Scarlett would have thrown something at him if Maria hadn't been holding her in place with pins. Instead, she had to content herself with imagining creative revenge while he escaped, laughing, out the front door. Despite the occasional frustration of wedding planning, Scarlett found herself caught up in the excitement of it. This was really happening. In 5 months, she'd be married to Jesse Carter, would officially become his wife and partner. They'd already drawn up plans for their house on the eastern pasture, had discussed in detail how they'd arrange the furniture and plant the garden and structure their life together. Henry had decided to sign over partial ownership of the ranch to Jesse as a wedding gift, making him a full partner rather than just an employee. It was a generous gesture that spoke to Henry's respect for Jesse's abilities and his acceptance of him as family. Jesse had been overwhelmed when Henry told him, stammering his thanks and trying to refuse before Henry cut him off. "You've earned this," Henry had said firmly. "You've proven yourself 100 times over. Besides, when I'm gone, this ranch will be Scarlett's, and she'll need a partner who knows the land and the cattle and the business as well as she does. That's you, son. So accept the gift gracefully and help me run this operation for as long as I've got left in me." December brought heavier snows and the deep cold of a Colorado winter. The cattle were moved to lower pastures, the horses were kept in the new barn, and the men spent more time on indoor work, repairing tack, maintaining equipment, planning for spring. The pace of ranch life slowed, but there was a coziness to the winter months that Scarlett had always enjoyed. Long evenings by the fire, the whole household gathered in the front room, telling stories and making plans and simply being together. Jesse moved into the ranch house in January, taking the spare room that had served as his sick room so many times before. It raised a few eyebrows in town. Unmarried couples living under the same roof wasn't exactly proper, but Henry had made it clear that Jesse was family now, practically his son-in-law, and anyone who had a problem with the arrangement could take it up with him personally. No one did. Having Jesse in the house changed the dynamic in subtle but significant ways. He was there for breakfast every morning, there for dinner every evening, there for the quiet moments in between when Scarlett was working on accounts or reading or simply staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. They were learning each other's rhythms, each other's moods, each other's habits, both good and annoying. Scarlett discovered that Jesse snored when he was particularly tired, that he had a terrible singing voice he was completely unselfconscious about using, that he read slowly but thoroughly and could remember details from books he'd read years ago. Jesse learned that Scarlett was completely useless before her morning coffee, that she had a tendency to work herself to exhaustion if no one stopped her, that she could hold a grudge for days but could also forgive completely once she decided someone had suffered enough. They had their first real argument in February over something that seemed trivial at the time. Jesse had made a decision about moving some cattle without consulting Scarlett first, and she'd felt excluded from a choice that affected the ranch they were supposed to be running together. The argument escalated, both of them too stubborn to back down, until finally Henry intervened and sent them both to separate corners to cool off. They reconciled that evening, both apologizing for letting pride get in the way of partnership. It was a learning experience, Jesse realized. Being engaged wasn't the same as being married, but it was practice for marriage. An opportunity to figure out how to navigate disagreements and merge their independent lives into something shared. "We're going to fight sometimes," Scarlett said as they sat on the porch despite the cold, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "We're both too strong-willed to always agree." "I know, but we'll figure it out. We're good at figuring things out." Jesse pulled her closer, sharing warmth. "Besides, if we can survive the Barker gang and blood poisoning, we can survive a few arguments about cattle management." "Perspective," Scarlett agreed, "though I maintain that you should have consulted me before moving those cattle. And I maintain that you were in town and it needed to be done immediately, but I acknowledge that I could have left you a note explaining my reasoning." "Compromise. I can work with that." March brought the first signs of spring, melting snow, returning birds, the promise of renewal after the long winter. The wildflowers Scarlett had dreamed about began appearing on the hillsides, small brave splashes of color against the brown earth. Their house was under construction now, the foundation laid and the frame rising timber by timber, taking shape from dream to reality. Scarlett spent hours at the building site, watching the progress, imagining how it would look when complete. Jesse found her there one afternoon, standing in what would eventually be their front room, her eyes closed and a small smile on her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Everything. Our life here, the children we'll raise, growing old together in this house we're building. It feels real now, you know? For months it was just plans and dreams, but Now I can actually see it taking shape. "One more month," Jesse said, resting his chin on top of her head. "One more month, and you'll be my wife, and we can start filling this house with all those memories you're imagining. I can't wait." Neither can I. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations. Invitations were sent to ranchers and townspeople throughout the territory. Maria's dressmaking army completed their work, producing a gown that made Scarlett gasp when she first saw it. Simple but elegant, practical enough for a ranch wedding, but beautiful enough to make her feel like a bride. Food was planned, whiskey was procured despite Maria's protests about quantity, and the front yard was cleared and decorated for the ceremony. The night before the wedding, Scarlett couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, the same bed she'd slept in since childhood, and thought about how tomorrow she'd be married, would officially become Mrs. Jessie Carter, would begin the next chapter of her life. It should have been terrifying. She was so young, and marriage was such a permanent commitment. But instead, she felt only excitement and certainty. This was right. Jessie was right. Their future together was right. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Scarlett?" It was her father's voice. "You awake? Come in, Papa." Henry entered carrying a lantern and sat on the edge of her bed like he used to do when she was a little girl having nightmares. "Couldn't sleep either," he admitted. "Kept thinking about tomorrow, about my little girl getting married." "I'm not so little anymore." "No, you're not. You're a grown woman, capable and strong and about to start your own family. But you'll always be my little girl, Scarlett. That doesn't change just because you're getting married." He paused, his weathered face soft in the lantern light. "Your mother would be so proud of you, of the woman you've become, of the man you've chosen. Jesse's a good man, maybe the best man I've ever known. He'll treat you right, partner with you the way your mother and I partnered, build a life with you worth living." "I know he will. I'm not nervous about marrying him, Papa. I'm excited." "Good. That's how it should be." Henry pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box that Scarlett recognized. It had belonged to her mother. "Your mother wore this on our wedding day. I want you to have it, to wear it tomorrow. Something old, something borrowed, something to remind you that love endures even after death, that the family we build is the most important thing we do in this life." Scarlett opened the box to find her mother's wedding necklace, a simple gold chain with a small diamond pendant. She'd seen her mother wear it 1,000 times, remembered how it caught the light when her mother moved. Tears filled her eyes as she lifted it from the box. "Thank you, Papa. I'll treasure it always." "I know you will." Henry kissed her forehead, then stood. "Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a big day, and Maria will have both our hides if you're too tired to enjoy it." After he left, Scarlett lay back down, clutching the necklace and thinking about her mother, about the marriage her parents had shared, about the legacy of love that had shaped her understanding of what a partnership should be. She thought about Jesse, probably lying awake in his own room, thinking similar thoughts. And finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, she drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face. April 15th dawned clear and perfect, the kind of spring day that seemed designed specifically for outdoor weddings. The wildflowers were in full bloom on the hillsides, painting the landscape in shades of purple and yellow and white. The air was warm but not hot, carrying the scent of new grass and possibility. Scarlett woke to Maria bustling into her room with breakfast and commentary about how there was so much to do in so little time, and why was she still in bed when her wedding was in 6 hours? The house was already full of activity, women arriving to help with final preparations, men setting up chairs in the front yard, Henry barking orders about where to put the tables for the food. The next few hours passed in organized chaos. Scarlett was bathed, dressed, her hair arranged and rearranged until Maria was satisfied. She put on her mother's necklace, feeling the weight of it settle against her skin like a blessing. She put on the dress that had required so many fittings, and when she finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the elegant woman looking back. "You are beautiful," Maria said, tears in her eyes. "Your mother, she would be so proud." Guests began arriving in early afternoon, ranchers from neighboring spreads, townspeople from Crimson Creek, the territorial marshal and some of his deputies, even Jack Crawford and several of the Bar T riders who'd fought beside them against the Barker gang. The front yard filled with people, all dressed in their best clothes, all smiling and laughing and celebrating. Jesse stood at the makeshift altar they'd constructed near the garden, wearing new clothes that Henry had insisted on buying for him. Dark trousers, a white shirt, a vest that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face cleanly shaved, and when he saw Scarlett emerge from the house on her father's arm, his expression shifted into something that made her heart skip beats. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted by the circuit preacher who made rounds through the territory. Scarlett barely heard the words. She was too focused on Jesse's face, on his hands holding hers, on the overwhelming rightness of this moment. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and invited Jesse to kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was gentle and sweet and full of promise. The celebration that followed lasted into the evening. There was food and music and dancing, toasts given by people who'd known them both for years, and people who'd only recently met them but recognized something special in their partnership. Henry gave a speech that made Scarlett cry and laugh in equal measure. Maria gave a speech that was mostly in Spanish, but whose meaning was clear in every warm, loving word. As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the yard, Jesse and Scarlett slipped away from the party for a moment, walking hand in hand toward their nearly completed house. They stood in what would be their bedroom, looking out through the unfinished window at the celebration below and the mountains beyond. "We did it," Scarlett said softly. "We actually did it." "Are you surprised?" "A little. 6 months ago, if someone had told me this is where I'd be, married to you, building a house with you, starting a life with you, I wouldn't have believed it was possible." Jesse turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I would have believed it. I've known since that first battle that you were the one for me. The woman who could fight beside me, who could stitch my wounds without flinching, who could look at this wild, dangerous territory and see home." "I knew, Scarlett. Maybe before I was ready to admit it to myself, but I knew. And now here we are. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, partners in all things, ready to face whatever comes next. Together," Jesse agreed, "always together." They stood there as darkness fell, and stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over their first desperate ride to North Ridge, that had witnessed their battles and their healing and their choice to love each other despite all the reasons they could have found not to. Those stars would watch over them for years to come, through joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that make up a life well lived. Below them, the party continued. Music drifted up from the yard, along with laughter and the warm sounds of community celebrating. Their house would be finished in a few weeks, and then they'd move in, would begin filling it with furniture and memories and eventually children. The ranch would continue to thrive under their combined leadership, would grow and prosper and become known throughout the territory as a model of what could be achieved through hard work and smart management. There would be other challenges. There always were on the frontier. Hard winters and dry summers, market fluctuations and difficult calving seasons, conflicts with neighbors, and the eternal struggle of trying to build something lasting in a landscape that seemed determined to tear it down. But they'd face all of it together, two people who'd proven they could survive anything as long as they had each other. Years later, when they were old and their house was full of children and grandchildren, when the scars from those early battles had faded to thin white lines that only showed in certain light, they'd sit on their porch and watch the sunset and tell stories about the week that changed everything. About the ride to North Ridge and the battles that followed, about bullet wounds and blood poisoning and fierce determination to survive. About a love that grew in the midst of violence and fear that was forged in fire and proven through trial. They'd tell about the moment when Jesse pushed Scarlett out of the path of a bullet, the moment that changed the trajectory of both their lives. About how he said he'd be fine, until she saw the blood and knew he wasn't. About how that terrifying moment led to confessions and promises and a partnership that would last a lifetime. But that was all in the future. For now, they were young and newly married and full of hope, standing in their unfinished house while their wedding celebration continued below. The Colorado Territory spread out around them, vast and beautiful and wild, full of possibility and promise. Jesse pulled Scarlett close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, that same heart that had nearly stopped beating, that had fought its way back from the edge of death because there was too much to live for to give up easily. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he replied. For all the days were given and beyond. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood eternal watch, Scarlett and Jesse Carter began their life together. Two people who'd looked at chaos and chosen love, who'd faced death and chosen life, who'd been given every reason to play it safe but had chosen courage instead. They'd survived the fire. They'd chosen each other. And that choice, made and remade every day in 1,000 small ways, would be the foundation of everything they built together. The story of Scarlett Hayes and Jesse Carter would be told in Crimson Creek for generations. The woman and the man who'd defended their ranch, who'd fallen in love amid violence, who'd proven that even in the wildest territory, home was wherever you chose to build it with someone you loved. And they lived that story day by day, year by year, building their legacy one choice at a time, one sunrise at a time, one moment of shared joy or shared struggle at a time. Not perfect, not without difficulty, but theirs. Wholly and completely theirs. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A life lived fully, a love claimed bravely, a home built together on the solid foundation of mutual respect and partnership. They'd been given that gift, and they never took it for granted, never forgot how close they'd come to losing it, never stopped being grateful for the chance to share it. The frontier was unforgiving, but it was also generous to those brave enough to claim what it offered. Scarlett and Jesse had been that brave, and their reward was a lifetime together, built on blood and courage and love that refused to die even when death came calling. It was enough. It was everything. It was their story, and it would endure long after they were gone, a testament to what two people could build when they chose each other above all else.